Have you ever fallen in love with a game and wished you'd started playing it years ago? I've had this experience a few times, but most recently in October 2025, I had it with Warframe. What is Warframe? This is a question I've had for the last few years, as a number of friends and community members have recommended this game to me based on other games I enjoy. This is how Warframe slowly generated aura in the background of my mind, with recommendation after recommendation, until earlier this year, I decided I needed to download it and find out what all the hype was about. This video is the story of that experience. Going into Warframe completely blind, learning the game's mechanics, and experiencing all of its story quests for the first time. My understanding of what it actually would be was pretty vague. I knew it's a sci-fi MMO third-person shooter that takes place in the solar system. A big part of the game involves unlocking characters with unique abilities called Warframes, and that it was developed by Digital Extremes. Beyond this, I knew absolutely nothing about the story or most core gameplay mechanics. Going in blind wasn't an intentional choice. Instead, I realized gradually after the first 2 or 3 hours that I didn't know anything, so I decided to keep it that way for the purposes of reviewing the new player experience. I would only look things up if I got stuck during a part of gameplay and didn't know how to progress, wasn't understanding the tutorial of a mechanic, or needed help figuring out what order to play stuff in. After an hour or 2 of gameplay, I tried to look online at the history of Warframe updates to see when various quests were added to figure out the best order to play them in, but ended up more confused than when I started. The release order of these story quests seems to not correlate with their placement in the narrative and new player experience, so I'm going to discuss them in the order I played them. On my failed quest to figure out the chronology of Warframe, I discovered a resource that became very important to the following 70 hours of gameplay. The Warframe website has a quest guide that groups the main quests into 4 story arcs and lists them in the order they become available. I stuck to that order for quests listed and mostly played other quests in the order I unlocked them. Warframe divides story quests into 3 buckets: main quests, Warframe quests, and side quests. The Warframe quests and side quests are not included on the Warframe quest guide online, except for Seiya's Vigil. This video is already going to be quite long, so I'm only going to discuss main quests. The quest guide groups the story into 4 arcs: Awakening, the War Within Saga, the New War Saga, and the Void War Saga. Arc 1 starts with the new player tutorial quest, Awakening. This isn't listed on the quest guide because every new player must begin with this quest. It opens with a 6-minute cinematic that introduces the world of Warframe. 3 main concepts are introduced: the Old War, the Tenno, and the Grineer. We learn that the Tenno were warriors who fought in the Old War, overthrowing the rulers but then left, fading away into memory. We also see that the Tenno fought the Grineer in the Old War. The cinematic concludes with Lotus, the narrator, waking the Tenno back up. The player is then given the option between 3 starter Warframes, and then plays a mission that introduces basic combat and movement mechanics, as Lotus guides the newly awoken Tenno to escape Grineer forces. I chose Mag as my starter Warframe, and played her for most of the main story. Lotus serves as the primary source of exposition for the player, as she guides them through learning how to be a Tenno and sends them on missions. By proxy, she acts as the player's guide through Warframe's early game, which I think is executed as reasonably as you could expect without being clunky. Overall, I think Awakening is a good new player tutorial. It effectively introduces new players to the world, story, and gameplay of Warframe without being too overwhelming. The cinematic does run a bit on the long side, though. The second quest, Vor's Prize, is just a continuation of the tutorial, but it's a new quest that begins after completing Awakening. Vor's prize involves the Tenno freeing themselves from a Grineer commander named Vor, who wants to capture them for the Grineer's queens. For some reason, there are certain story quests that you can't replay, but others that you can't. Vor's prize is one of the unreplayable quests, which I think is a bad idea. It serves as a continuation of Awakening that introduces the player to the world and tutorializes more basic mechanics. Replaying Vor's prize would be a good resource for lapsed players to get back into Warframe if they've forgotten how basic mechanics work. I would know, because I lied a little bit at the beginning of this video. I played about an hour and a half of Warframe in January, but got busy with life stuff and didn't pick the game back up until late September. By that point, I had no idea what was going on and learned I couldn't reset my account, so I made a second account to replay the stuff I had already done before returning to my original account. This is clunky and can turn off lapsed players. The player is also introduced to another main character named Ortis, who is a Cephalon, an AI that controls the player's ship. Ortis is a bit glitchy and prone to wild swings in emotion and affect, which I find endearing. I have a bit of a weakness for emotionally compromised AIs and robots, because their imperfections make them feel very human. I also think that Ortis can be quite funny at times. Vor's prize introduces the player to crafting, has them meet an arms dealer named Darvo, and remove a control module that Vor has installed on them before killing Vor. It's a 45-minute quest that's a solid introduction to the game and is about as good as you could expect it to be. I'm going to break the chronology of this video for a moment. I started playing Warframe in late September and finished all of the main quests prior to the release of the Valis Undermine update, which came out on October 15th. This update introduced another new player main quest that I think is now part of Arc 1 for new players. It takes place between Vor's prize and Vox Solaris, and is a tutorial of the mod system. Because of when it was released, I played this after completing all of the main quests in Arc 4. The teacher does a better job than the tutorial of the mod system that I had, introducing the player to composite damage types that combine two elements, plus dissolving and infusing mods. Narratively, the teacher focuses on the Tenno meeting Teshin on Earth and being pursued by Corpus, who are introduced in Vor's prize, but weren't a major focus until Vox Solaris in the version of Arc 1 I played. This is an interesting story choice because Teshin and Lotus's conversations hint more directly at the Old War, which will become relevant when Teshin returns at the beginning of Arc 2. I think the addition of the teacher is good because it's a good tutorial, and it more directly hints at the main plot of Warframe than Vor's prize did. I wasn't wowed or blown away by the quest because it didn't teach me anything I didn't already know, but in particular, learning about composite mod types earlier would have helped me. I primarily learned about them from the wiki because I was confused about them based on the limited explanation the game initially provided me. The teacher also gave a better explanation of mod polarity than I had previously received initially. The teacher also ends with a pretty direct lead into Vox Solaris, which adds much needed connective tissue. More on that later. Returning to my new player experience after completing Vor's prize, Warframe told me to unlock the Venus Solar Rail Junction and proceed to Vox Solaris. However, the quest guide listed Seiya's Vigil before Vox Solaris, so instead of progressing to Venus, I played missions on Earth to get to Cetus, where Seiya's Vigil takes place. I'm guessing the reason Seiya's Vigil is skipped here is that the game technically classifies it as a side quest. Anytime there was a contradiction between the quest guide and what the game told me to do, I stuck to the quest guide whenever possible. Seiya's Vigil introduces the player to the people of Cetus, a social and vendor hub connected to the Plains of Eidolon open world map. As part of this, the player is introduced to bounties, which serve as little missions you do for the people of the associated city on the open world map. The player is helping Kanzu and Seiya investigate the death of Seiya's husband Anko, allowing Seiya to gain closure while simultaneously protecting Cetus from Grineer attacks. I didn't really have any strong reactions to this quest, and thought it was solid for a side quest to expand the world. I'm guessing the reason Seiya's Vigil is included in Arc 1, even though it's a side quest, is that Cetus becomes relevant to the main plot in future arcs, so having an introduction before that makes sense. Every other open world location in Warframe has a main quest introducing it, so it probably is also related to the fact that Cetus doesn't. You honestly could reclassify it as a main quest to reduce some of the confusion. After Seiya's Vigil, I proceeded along the solar rail to Venus for Vox Solaris, which is the main quest for Fortuna and the associated open world orb Valis. Vox Solaris was the first story quest I played that actually felt substantial to me narratively. The story focuses on Corpus introducing the player to one of their board members, Nef Anyo. Anyo serves as the villain of Vox Solaris, basically being a kleptocratic robber baron. Corpus is essentially a cult to capitalism, where profit is seen as a kind of religious force. The Tenno helps the people of Fortuna, called the Solaris, fight back against Nef's unethical labor practices, as most of the residents of Fortuna are in debt slavery to Anyo and Corpus. Fortuna is a company town, allowing Nef Anyo to abuse his workers. The Tenno facilitates the resurgence of Vox Solaris, a figurehead for labor resistance in Fortuna, and successfully secures concessions from Nef for the Solaris via violent resistance. I thought the story was well executed and enjoyable. It reminded me a lot of the Vox Populi storyline in BioShock Infinite, with similar themes and influences, just with a much lighter tone. I have to heap some praise on the cutscene that introduces Fortuna. Watching the Solaris sing a work song in unison as you watch them work is a fantastic choice.
And we all lift, and we're all adrift together.
It sets the Solaris up as a tight-knit community, which helps the corporate exploitation hit harder when it's revealed. It also helps that the music is catchy as hell. There was a moment where I got stuck in Vox Solaris that I want to mention. One of the Orb Valis objectives requires the player to do what essentially amounts to the excavation mission type. The only problem is that it doesn't explain how that mission type works, and I had never done an excavation mission before, so I didn't know how the fuel cell mechanic worked. I ended up trying and failing multiple times before looking it up and finding out that I was failing because I wasn't fueling the generators. I went and played my first excavation mission on Earth, which actually explained the game type to me, then returned to the quest and was able to beat that part on the first try. I think this is just an oversight in the organization of early game quests, as the player is recommended to do this quest very early, and may not have done that mission type before. I'll talk about this more later. After Vox Solaris, I played Once Awake, which takes place on Mercury and is designed to introduce the player to the Infested, a faction of space zombies that are created by some kind of pathogen. In Once Awake, we learn the Grineer are deliberately creating Infested to use as a bioweapon, so Lotus sends the Tenno to destroy the Grineer's research. Once Awake is one of the shortest story quests in the entire game. It took me only 25 minutes to complete, which was so short that I verbally exclaimed, "Wait, that's it?" when I finished it. It felt like there was barely any substance to the story, and it was over as soon as it started. Even the tutorial quests felt like they had more of a story to tell. I wish Once Awake was a bit longer and delved more into the origins of the Infested, because my understanding of them was pretty lacking, even very late into the main plot. I'm gonna pause here for a moment for some housekeeping. I deliberately have been avoiding engaging with the deep lore in the Codex during my playthrough of Warframe's main story and the writing of this video. I know that explanations likely exist in lore for some of the story stuff I mentioned being confused by in this video. I wanted to avoid spoilers, and figured that it was likely I could accidentally run into spoilers for future campaigns if I looked into the lore. Additionally, I believe that the storytelling in the main quest of a game should be able to stand on its own. Dealing with world building and exposition in an elegant way is one of the integral parts of writing a good story, so I wanted to be able to fairly evaluate that. If a new player has to go engage with lore to understand the main plot of your game, you've failed as a storyteller. In my opinion, the purpose of lore should be to deepen an already invested player's understanding of your world, not be a crutch for explaining confusing main quests. I'm reviewing both the story and new player experience in this video, and most players aren't going to dive into the lore until they're very deep into a game, or sometimes ever. As a result, I wanted to critique the presentation of the new player experience, unbiased by the lore, because that's how most new players will experience it. After Once Awake, I headed back through Earth to unlock Mars. Upon passing through the junction, I was given a tutorial on void relics, and clicked on a button in the menu that takes you to Varzia to learn about Aya and Prime Warframes. At this point, I had essentially no idea what the void was, and didn't understand the Orokin yet, so the explanation went way over my head. Listening to it with knowledge from future story quests, it makes perfect sense, but at the time I was confused as hell. I could tell that the void was going to be important though. Afterwards, I made my way to Mars's moon Deimos to do the Heart of Deimos quest. This quest introduces the player to the Entrati family, who were pioneers in void technology. The Old War and Orokin are mentioned in passing a few times, so I started to get a better picture of that mentally. The quest focuses on a MacGuffin called the Heart of Deimos that the Entratis are protecting from the infestation. If the heart stops beating, Tennos lose their power. I didn't completely understand the void connection until I got later context from future story quests. Nonetheless, I found the dysfunctional relationships of the Entrati family amusing and a little too relatable. About halfway through the quest, you go to investigate the heart, and it stops beating, causing your Warframe to become non-functional. This causes you to need to use stealth to get out of the cave the heart is in, without being killed by constructs that are stalking the halls. If you get seen, you die instantly. I like this section a lot because it raised the stakes of the rest of the quest and felt like a nice change of pace. You need to revive the heart in order to get your Warframe functional again. After making it out alive, the family gives you a void mech called a necromech to fight your way back to the heart so that you can dispel the infestation and revive the heart. Using the mech felt very satisfying and powerful, contrasting the disempowerment of using a non-functional Warframe in the previous section. The story ends with a final reveal. The player meets Grandmother, who implies she orchestrated the crisis to get the family to set aside their differences and work together again. Talk about dysfunctional parenting. That final reveal is the cherry on top that makes Heart of Deimos easily my favorite quest of Arc 1. A lot of the references to Warframe's history went over my head a bit in this quest because I still was a bit confused by Warframe's world and didn't have context for some major world building elements like the Orokin, the infestation, the void, and how all of that is connected. It's only in retrospect looking at my gameplay footage that I fully get what's going on here, which does do the quest a bit of a disservice. finally, the last quest listed for Arc 1 is the Archwing. This quest doesn't have a substantial story. It's basically about the Tenno raiding some Orokin and Corpus locations to get the data and materials they need to build an Archwing, a frame used by Tenno for extravehicular activity and combat in 0G. The quest ends pretty abruptly after you build your Archwing and use it in a single mission. I think it would have been cool to use it for a space boss fight, to make the ending feel a bit less anticlimactic. I also think that placing Archwing at the end of Arc 1 does the arc a bit of a disservice. You want a story arc to go out with a bang, not a whimper. Something like Heart of Deimos would have been a better conclusion in my opinion. I'm not gonna lie, when I was playing through Arc 1, my reactions and thoughts towards the story of Warframe weren't exactly flattering. I wouldn't really call Arc 1 a story arc. I think labeling the quests you play in the early game Arc 1 created some expectations that weren't met. Had I not looked at the quest guide and just played these quests, I don't think I would have been as disappointed. Let me explain. When I hear about a story arc in a piece of serialized media, I, and most people, will assume that the arc is one large narrative in many pieces. Each piece will be their own individual story, but there will be some kind of connective tissue or narrative through line that unifies those individual stories into a larger arc. You don't necessarily need one big plot that runs through everything either. Sometimes story arcs are characterized by common themes. The individual stories just need to feel like they fit together in some way in order for them to work as an arc. They need some kind of narrative connective tissue, and the finale needs to feel like a climax. Warframe's Arc 1 lacks this, and instead feels like a series of disconnected stories that exist within the same world. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there isn't a sense of momentum or narrative progression, which made me feel a bit confused and disappointed. This isn't to say that the individual quests are bad or anything, they just don't fit together in a satisfying way. The introduction of the teacher serves to remedy this problem a bit by acting as connective tissue between Vor's Prize and Vox Solaris. If more connective tissue was introduced, you could potentially make this into an actual story arc. It just doesn't work as one right now. When I finished Arc 1, my charitable reading of it was that it was a learning arc. The writers were figuring out what they wanted the story of Warframe to be, but couldn't tie it together into a cohesive arc. However, when I looked into the chronology, it turns out that's not actually what's going on here, and the structure of Arc 1 is more of a deliberate choice than I originally thought. Remember how I said that I tried to look up the chronological order of quests and was confused by release dates? It turns out a lot of Arc 1 isn't Arc 1 by release order. Vor's Prize, Once Awake, and Archwing are where they should be in release order, but were followed by Arc 2 quests Natah, The Second Dream, The War Within, and Chains of Harrow. Seiya's Vigil is released next, then The Sacrifice, the conclusion of Arc 2. Afterwards, Vox Solaris is released, followed by Rising Tide, which is placed in the middle of Arc 2 in the arc structure. Then finally Heart of Deimos releases. Awakening isn't released until 2020, but is designed as an introduction to the world and tutorial mission, so its placement makes a lot of sense. I've already explained the introduction of the teacher. The story then continues in release order for Arcs 3 and 4. I can understand the reshuffling of these quests conceptually from a gameplay perspective. The open world quests don't connect to the main storyline of Arc 2, so they can be played anytime before Arc 3. My guess for the intention behind placing them in Arc 1 is to use them to introduce the player to the various planets via story quests. A lot of the new player experience is based around the solar rail junctions, which require you to do certain tasks, complete quests, and do tutorials for mechanics to progress to the next planet. From a game design perspective, this makes sense. It avoids overwhelming the player with too many gameplay mechanics at once, and allows them to learn and explore at their own pace. even if the quest tooltips will repeatedly try to prompt you to progress to the next quest or junction as soon as possible. In comparison to arcs 2, 3, and 4, which are very clearly set up as cohesive story arcs with plot progression, unifying themes, and climaxes, Arc 1 looks pretty bad. It also doesn't help that you can't start Arc 2 with Natah until you've unlocked Uranus. For me, that took about 20 hours of gameplay. Natah is where I actually started to get fully invested in the story. Additionally, the game recommends you do the Duviri Paradox after you unlock Uranus prior to Natah, which is a whole different can of worms that I'll talk about when I discuss Arc 3. I would argue that the fundamental problems with Arc 1 are that it wasn't originally designed to be a story arc in the way that future arcs were, and delays players who are invested in the main story from actually starting it. I don't think there's an easy solution to this problem because the junction system tutorializes a lot of mechanics in useful ways, so waiting to do some of the earlier junctions in favor of later quests might lead to players struggling with gameplay. If I was trying to order the various quests for maximal narrative flow and cohesion, disregarding solar rails, here's the order I would have chosen to play them in with hindsight. Awakening, Vor's Prize, Once Awake, The Teacher, Vox Solaris, Archwing, Natah, The Second Dream, The War Within. The War Within doesn't need to be immediately followed by Chains of Harrow narratively, so this is where I would reinsert the stuff I've skipped. Once Awake is placed after Vor's Prize in this order because you assassinate Vor on Mercury, and Once Awake is a Mercury Grineer quest, which feels like a logical progression. Originally, prior to the introduction of the Teacher, I would have put Vox Solaris after the War Within, but the Teacher gives connective tissue that connects directly to Vox Solaris, and Archwing is another Corpus quest, so it makes sense to put it there. The player needs an Archwing for Natah, which is why I put it right before Natah. After the War Within, I would then do Heart of Deimos and Seiya's Vigil, before proceeding with Chains of Harrow. Rising Tide could honestly go anywhere between the War Within and the beginning of Arc 3. You might as well put it between the War Within and Chains of Harrow, if that's when we're taking a diversion from the main plot to do Heart of Deimos and Seiya's Vigil anyways. I think Heart of Deimos works better with the knowledge of the void you get from Second Dream and the War Within, which is why I put it there. I can't explain why I put Seiya's Vigil directly before Chains of Harrow without Arc 2 spoilers, so I'll talk about that later. Even if we don't change any of the quest order, I wouldn't advertise Arc 1 as an arc, and instead just combine Arcs 1 and 2 into some kind of ridiculous mega arc, because Awakening is more connected to the Second Dream than any of the other story quests. The main drawbacks to this restructuring are that the new order doesn't mesh well with the solar rail system, and you pump the brakes on Arc 2's narrative to do Rising Tide, Heart of Deimos, and Seiya's Vigil, but the current version of Arc 2 already does this with Rising Tide, so it's not a huge change. The main advantage of this structure is keeping the quests closer to release order, so that there's fewer unintended narrative consequences from playing things out of their original context. It also gets you to what I consider the good stuff earlier. How would you actually implement this? I am well aware that I'm not a game dev, so I don't know how difficult of an ask some of this stuff is, but I'm going to make a suggestion. Give the player more agency about the order they do things in. You could have some kind of choice screen where you ask the player what their priority is. I envision 3 types of player. Option 1 would be, I want to play the main story, which is the type of player I am. This would direct the player to just play the story quests in the order I outlined, while placing relevant tutorial screens before quests that require them. It also would be nice if you didn't need to do all the solar rail stuff and could just get into the story and do the rails afterwards. The second option would be, I want to explore the solar system. This type of player would be told to proceed through the solar rail junctions and unlock every planet and moon, following the order the game currently tells you to. The third option would be, I want to upgrade my arsenal. This player would be directed to the Duviri Paradox early on, possibly directly after Vox Solaris, because Duviri has post-quest content that lets you unlock Warframes easily. Afterwards, you would progress through the solar system with the rail junctions. This kind of individually tailored approach has the benefit of allowing the players to choose what's most important to them, and then funnel them into the content best suited to them faster. This could potentially improve new player retention and reduce confusion a bit. Granted, I'm not sure if the amount of effort required to restructure the new player experience this much would be worth it in terms of dev resources. It certainly would have reduced the friction and confusion I felt with Warframe's new player experience, though. I could see a possible timeline where I quit Warframe before getting to Arc 2 story content, which is what got me to fall in love with the game. I enjoyed the gameplay and some story moments prior to that point, but I felt the game was confusing and lacked a sense of meaning and purpose to keep me engaged. The reason I stuck with it is all of that praise and hype I'd heard about the game prior to starting, and also the fact that I was a captive audience. Before starting Warframe, I set the intention of playing through all of Warframe's story content to make a review of it. Afterwards, I was going to decide if I wanted to stick with the game or not. By the time I finished the War Within, I was sold on Warframe because of its story, and decided I was gonna stick around. Another request that I have for my early game confusion is to implement some kind of timeline feature in-game that tells you when the various side and Warframe quests take place, or at the very least add a section to the quest guide that tells you that information. A lot of players probably wouldn't care, but this would be hugely appreciated by new story-focused players like myself, and generally reduce confusion, making it easier to decide which quest is best suited to play next from a narrative perspective. I played non-main quests roughly in the order I unlocked them, which didn't correlate to their release order very well, at least for the Warframe quests. Some of them clearly have plot elements that would spoil certain story quests, or be confusing to players if played out of order. Warframe mostly does a decent job of not unlocking spoilery quests until you've played the relevant main quests. However, I unlocked the Deadlock Protocol after completing Saturn Junction and played it right away because I knew I couldn't start Natah until getting to Uranus. Most of the quest was fine and didn't spoil anything, but the very end, a message from the antagonist, revealed a spoiler that confused me, which I'll mention in my discussion of Arc 3. Let's just say for story-minded players I wouldn't recommend playing it until after Prelude to War. I've hyped up Natah and Arc 2 in the discussion of my issues with Arc 1, so let's get into why I liked it so much. Early on, I wanted to know more about Lotus. I wanted to understand who she was, what her motivations were, and why she had resurrected the Tenno. The fact that Arc 1 told me almost nothing about her frustrated me. I wanted to understand why I should listen to and trust her. I also began to become much more curious about the Old War as I unlocked Mars and played Heart of Deimos. It clearly was important to the narrative, but hadn't been delved into with any depth. The reason I liked Natah so much is that it finally started to answer these questions. Natah introduces the Sentients, a faction who fought the Orokin during the Old War. Given that the teacher didn't exist yet, Natah was my introduction to Teshin. He's described as a pseudo-Tenno, which I would later learn means he's a Dax. Teshin and Lotus don't seem to trust each other, so the Tenno is torn between the two of them. Teshin says that Lotus is hiding things from us, and that he can show us the truth. This narrative played into my frustration that I didn't know anything about Lotus, and made me start to distrust her a bit. The whole concept of a pseudo-Tenno also made me even more curious about the nature and origins of the Tenno. The Grineer opened the tomb of the sentient, Hunhao, who was sealed away on Uranus during the Old War. Hunhao calls out to Lotus, referring to her as his daughter. Natah. We learn that Natah came with her father to the Origin system during the Old War and was supposed to destroy the Tenno, but she didn't finish the job. We reseal Hun Hao's tomb and Lotus reveals her motivation. Traveling to the Origin system rendered her infertile, so after the war ended she didn't destroy the Tenno. Instead, she protected them by hiding them within something called the Second Dream. Now that the Tenno has reawakened, she sees them as her child, which is why she's been leading, guiding, and protecting us. I absolutely loved this reveal. It gives Lotus a complicated and interesting character arc. During the Old War, the Tenno originally fought Natah as an enemy, but now she protects us as our surrogate space mother, the Lotus. This fits well with her role in the story, especially the early game, where she's essentially walking the player through their first steps in the new world, like a newborn child learning from their mother. You've heard of enemies to lovers, now get ready for enemies to mother. The sentient reveal also helps flesh out the world by giving a bit more background on the Old War, which I appreciated. The key thing we learn is that the war led to the near destruction of both peoples. Natah also feels like the beginning of a story arc. I don't know how to fully articulate this, but after decades of observing stories, I just kinda get a vibe when a narrative is going somewhere. Natah got me very excited for Arc 2 and the future of Warframe's story. It was easily my favorite when I played it, but I had no idea what was in store for me with the Second Dream, which is where Warframe's story hits the gas. To start it, I needed to unlock Neptune Junction. The Second Dream is a direct sequel to Natah. The opening cutscene sets the scene perfectly, with some amazing music. The Stalker, a character who hunts Tenno, communes with Hun Hao and the Sentients. Hun Hao instructs the Stalker to find the place where Lotus has hidden the Tenno, the Second Dream. In reaction, Lotus sends the Tenno on a mission to find fragments of Hun Hao retrieved by the Grineer. Alad V gives Lotus the information about where to find them. However, he's the boss you assassinate to unlock Saturn, which every player needs to do prior to unlocking Uranus and accessing Natah, so I was confused about why he's still alive after I killed him, seemingly with no explanation, not even a somehow Palpatine returned. It turns out that the sentient fragments were actually a trap Hun Hao was using to learn the location of the reservoir and the Second Dream. This forces Lotus to reveal her deception to the Tenno, which is one of the craziest reveals in all of Warframe's story. Prior to the Second Dream, I had been wondering why Earth's moon wasn't on the Origin system map, even though multiple other moons like Deimos, Phobos, and Europa are playable locations. So imagine my surprise when Lotus reveals that the Second Dream was on the moon, which she had hidden inside the void after it was thought destroyed during the Old War.
The moon exists! It was in the void all along. I knew the Lotus was powerful, but she erased history.
It was a very gratifying reveal, given how much I had been wondering about the moon. In real life, astronomers call the moon Luna after the Roman goddess who was the personification of the moon, in keeping with the Roman gods the planets are named after. Warframe bucks this trend, calling the moon Lua, which is the Portuguese word for the moon. Lua was apparently a separate Roman goddess, whose soldiers prayed to when they were at war, hoping she would break the weapons of their enemies. She also was said to protect Rome. This connection makes a lot of sense narratively, given that Natah's mission was to destroy the Tenno, making her Lua in this illusion. Instead of breaking them, Natah hid her enemies' weapons away in the void. Now Hun Hao is trying to undo this act and destroy the Tenno once and for all, making him the Lua of the Second Dream. The Tenno follows the Stalker to Lua, where he brings Lua back from the void into reality. The Tenno then beats the Stalker to the reservoir where the Second Dream is hidden and opens the door. This prompts Warframe's biggest narrative reveal. Inside the pod is a person. Opening the pod causes the Tenno to shut down, so the person crawls to the Tenno, who awkwardly picks them up. The Tenno slowly carries the operator through a series of sentient drones, while the operator attacks them by harnessing the power of the void into their hands. The Tenno and the operator return to the ship, ship, but the stalker is there. The stalker disables the Tenno by sticking a sword through their chest and is about to kill the operator, but then the Tenno breaks the sword, causing Stalker and Hunhao to be banished. With the Tenno injured and the operator weak, Lotus comes into the room and carries her child into the somatic link, the new segment aboard the ship that houses the operator. Then the music swells and the screen fades to the character creator, allowing the player to customize their operator's appearance. Early on in the game, I identified with my starter Warframe Mag because she was my only avatar in the world of Warframe. So the reveal that the Tenno is just a puppet, and the real person I've been controlling this whole time is a child who's been asleep in a pod, hit like a truck. Playing through 24 hours of gameplay prior to even creating your character is such a mindfuck that I loved. It's one of those twists that only works in a video game, and is one of the best I've ever experienced, because it completely changed my perception of the game and its world. The 1-2 punch of the Lua and Operator reveals was the thing that truly made me fall in love with Warframe. After creating your character, Lotus apologizes for her deception and explains the nature of the Tenno.
This is who you really are, a Tenno. More than human, but once a child like any other.
Lotus explains that the operator was a child aboard the Zariman 10-0, a ship that experienced an accident when trying to jump through the void. The ship's adults were killed, but the children survived, and were changed by the void, gaining powers. The Orokin were going to kill the children, but Margulis stopped them, eventually creating the Tenno, having the children project their minds into Warframes and use them for combat. I appreciated that Warframe gives you dialogue options here, helping you choose your operator's personality and memories of the events that happened to them prior to being hidden by Lotus. It helped me identify with my operator, making me imagine I was her. The entirety of the second dream is absolute cinema, but especially the ending inside the ship. The music after Lotus picks up the operator is just perfect, somber but also hopeful. The second dream, even now that I've played all the main quests, remains one of my favorites. Its reveals hit different. Lotus's words in the final cutscene set up the next story quest. She says,
"Now we fight on two fronts, my child. The war without, and the war within."
Naturally, Warframe made me unlock Pluto Junction before letting me continue the story I was hyped for. For some reason, the quest guide lists Rising Tide between the second dream and the War Within, but I don't think that order makes sense because the War Within is a direct sequel to the second dream. The game apparently agrees because completing the War Within is required to unlock Rising Tide. Someone might want to update the quest guide to reflect that. The War Within focuses on the Operator, Teshin, and the Grineer. It expands upon the lore behind the Zariman, Margulis, and Daxus. The Operator follows Teshin into a trap laid by the Grineer Queens. Because Teshin is a Dax, he must obey Orikins, which is what the Queens are. They want to transfer one of their minds into the body of the Operator, stealing their youth. When they attempt this, it destroys the Operator's link to their Warframe. They find themselves in an Orokin ruin atop a snowy mountain, where Teshin fights back without disobeying the Queens by training them to master their power over the Void, to wield when not using a Warframe. This involves mastering the ability to take control of other beings via an ability called Transference. The Operator uses this training to escape the ruin and travel to the Queens, where they fight back and regain control over their Warframe and defeat the Queen. Afterwards, the player is given a choice. Do they kill the Queen, let Teshin kill the Queen, or spare her? At the very end, a mysterious voice possesses the Operator and speaks through them.
Don't forget, kiddo, you're nothing without me.
I didn't understand this moment at the time, but it becomes relevant in the future. The War Within builds upon the second dream by introducing the ability to play as the Operator and use their abilities in combat, fully realizing the twist that Warframes are just puppets through gameplay, which was a welcome evolution. I loved that the War Within forces the player out of their comfort zone, their Warframe abilities that they're likely comfortable with at this point, to disempower them and make them learn how to control an operator. The whole quest is a slick tutorial for operators and transference that helps you understand how to utilize both your Warframe and operator to overcome more complicated combat challenges. The War Within is also the first story quest to feature bespoke levels unique to the quest. Previously, all campaigns had either used existing procedurally generated levels on the various destinations, or were special bounties in the open worlds, with added dialogue, cutscenes, and unique scripted gameplay moments. As a result, the gameplay of campaigns didn't feel that different from the average mission, because the environment was very samey. The War Within's bespoke levels elevate the story by changing up the gameplay, which made them stand out from the rest of Warframe. It adds to the sense of disorientation that both the player and operator are supposed to feel, being cut off from their Warframe and forced to learn to fight on their own. The War Within is also the first quest where the ending is completely up to the player. This helps the player identify even further with the operator by choosing how they conduct themselves in major narrative moments. Even though the options are relatively limited, I thought they elevated the experience. The War Within is inherently a coming-of-age story for the operator. They're growing up and learning to reckon with the impact of their existence in the world, starting to make difficult choices like whether to kill the queens and whether or not to use their kuva. I chose to kill the queen myself to free Teshin from being controlled by her, but also save him from having to do it. I also chose to control the kuva. The War Within didn't have any moments as impactful as the twists in the second dream, but several moments gave me chills, mainly being severed from my Warframe, some of the reveals in the ruin, and the final battle against the queens. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit this next story, but I'm going to share it because I think it's a teachable moment. In the section where the player is supposed to learn transference, I got confused and wasted about 30 minutes doing the wrong thing. When I got to the part where one of the golden maws pops out of the bones and you're supposed to use the void sling to stun it, I successfully stunned it, but didn't use transference fast enough to take control, so it killed me, playing the death cutscene. The issue happened immediately afterwards when I respawned. My camera was looking at the wall in the middle of the passageway, and I got confused about which direction I had come from. I ended up wasting a bunch of time trying to stun the wrong monster, because I got turned around and doubled back to the room before the transference tutorial, where the maws don't pop out of the bones, so you can't stun them. I tried to look up how to do it and found a bunch of players talking about glitches with the maw, so for a bit I thought it was glitched. Eventually, not knowing what else to do, I restarted the game and had my progress reset to earlier in the level. When I got back to the transference tutorial for the second time, I realized that I had gotten turned around and was trying to stun the wrong enemy from the previous section of the level. It was simply not possible to perform the mechanic on those earlier enemies, so the game wasn't bugged. I had just gotten confused and walked in the wrong direction after respawning. This was a humbling revelation because I was definitely frustrated with the game at this point and had to face the fact that I was to blame. This is a teachable moment for players. It's possible that sometimes when you think things are glitched, you're just not understanding how the mechanic works or doing something wrong. The issue is that it's hard to tell from the outside when something is working as intended, especially if it's a new mechanic you haven't encountered before. A common instinct is to believe that you're doing it right and blame the game because you don't understand what you're doing wrong. However, as a general life lesson, you often don't know or understand as much as you think you do, especially when learning something for the first time. This isn't to claim that none of those players were experiencing bugs, as I'm pretty sure some or even most were, but most importantly, I wasn't. On the dev side, there's also a lesson, but it's not revolutionary. No matter how much you test or how hard you try to design something to be easy to understand, once it's live, your end users users will always find a creative way to fuck things up in unintended ways. All you can really do in that situation is try to implement a fix after the fact to mitigate arcane user error. I think the easiest fix that would have solved my problem was a waypoint marking the specific enemy I was supposed to stun and use transference on, after a few minutes of failing to do so. This is the kind of thing that wouldn't occur to you unless you observed someone failing in the specific way I was, because most players wouldn't need it. I'm not trying to imply that there's a major design flaw that caused this misunderstanding, because it was my fault in the end, but if you want to craft the smoothest and most enjoyable experience possible for end users, making little tweaks to prevent issues like this can help significantly, because unfortunately there's always a risk someone quits a game because of something seemingly minor like this, especially given that you're locked out of the rest of the game during the War Within and can't get back to it without beating the quest. After beating the War Within, I immediately started Rising Tide, since the quest guide listed it before the War Within. Pretty much every main quest prior to this point was about 1 to 2 hours long. However, Rising Tide took me 5.5 hours to beat, and not because the quest is brimming with content. The reason was that Rising Tide has a different structure than most main quests, one that's more common with Warframe quests. Instead of simply playing through missions in a linear order, the player has to craft or build something between pretty much every mission, and the costs are significant for a new player. To even start the quest, I needed to craft a railjack cephalon, but I didn't have enough mutagen samples, so I had to play missions on Deimos to farm for them until I got enough. Also, I was still very new to Warframe, so I didn't know how to efficiently farm materials using Warframe mods and optimal levels, so this progress took longer than it should have. After crafting the cephalon, I met Cephalon Sai and learned what the structure of this quest was going to be. I would play a mission where I recovered a part for my railjack, and then would travel to the dry dock where I would get some more Cephalon Sai dialogue before being asked to provide the materials to repair the part and integrate it into my railjack. Of course, most of the time I wouldn't have enough of at least one of the currencies required and would have to go farm for them. This led to a constant feeling of stop and go, being blocked from progressing the story by not having enough resources. I didn't like this quest mostly because of that constant sense of friction, where I kept experiencing a tiny portion of the story, then had to do a bunch of busy work to progress. Cephalon Sai's personality also added to my frustration a bit. He's very dry and emotionless, frequently telling the player they need to hurry up and get the railjack built, sometimes at inappropriate times, like when I was about to launch the next mission, but just waiting for his dialogue to finish, or when I was in the middle of a mission already working on the objective to the best of my ability. Sai has a bunch of dialogue that explains this personality. Essentially, it's a trauma response to losing his crew on his final railjack mission, which is understandable in a vacuum, but combined with the frustrating quest design to make me dislike Rising Tide. Requiring a bunch of resources to build something to progress the quest is one of those things that makes sense conceptually, especially for veterans who likely won't need to farm those materials, but usually ends up being annoying. I know there are players who don't mind this kind of structure, but it bounces off of me really hard. When playing a game like Warframe, my brain has 3 different modes: lock in and focus on the story, socialize and do something cooperatively, and farm resources in a zoned out flow state. All 3 are equally enjoyable, but they require different things from me. When I'm focusing on the story, I'm devoting my entire attention to the game. I am not thinking of anything outside of the game, and am minimizing potential distractions so that I can experience the story. Focusing on the story provides stimulation and enjoyment by learning new information that changes my understanding of characters or the world. When I'm doing something cooperatively, I will still be somewhat focused on the game, but equally focused on having a conversation or communicating with my friends and other players. I'm enjoying connecting with other people and trying to work together to achieve a common goal. Farming is most enjoyable for me if I put a podcast or YouTube video on in the background, so the deep thinking part of my brain is engaged with something, while my hands, eyes, and the reflex part of my brain performs the gameplay, which is satisfying. I'm still enjoying the game, I just need to stimulate my brain by listening to something to avoid getting distracted or letting my mind wander. Different parts of my brain are paying attention to different things, but I'm still focused. I can sometimes farm without a video or podcast, but I'm very prone to getting distracted or dissociating, so I'm paradoxically less present than if I had the podcast. As a result, switching between farming and focusing on story is difficult for me because my brain needs to manage my attention very differently during both activities and has trouble frequently switching modes. It's okay for me if both coexist within the same game, but I prefer to keep them confined to different play sessions or make a single switch midway through a session. Repeatedly trying to switch between the two usually comes at the expense of comprehending the story moments between all the grinding, which is why I don't like it when story quests are designed that way. I don't think I actually put a podcast on during Rising Tide because I didn't want to zone out, but I inevitably did zone out and my mind wandered, leading to me not fully processing Cephalon-sized story. It also didn't help that it was fragmented by all the farming, so each piece of information was separated by long stretches of unrelated gameplay, and also his delivery was very dry, which isn't necessarily bad for a robot, but also kind of makes it easier for me to zone out. I know there are players who aren't going to have issues with this kind of quest design and in fact might really enjoy it, but my attentional deficits and autism make it much harder for me to enjoy. When I actually got a chance to use my railjack at the end of the quest, I enjoyed it quite a bit, but the quest ends relatively quickly after a single 15-minute mission. It's basically a combat spaceship where you can cooperatively take different roles with teammates. I think it would have felt a bit better if there was a bit more railjack content at the end of the quest to make all that time spent building the railjack feel more worth it. There are some future quests that utilize the railjack pretty successfully, but the quest where you build it doesn't really. It ends kind of anticlimactically. After the War Within, the operator gets a mysterious message that tells them to come to a secret door in Cetus without their Warframe. Upon entering the door, the player meets Anko, Seiya's missing husband, who gives them a mote amp, the base weapon an operator uses. Anko implies he has seen many future timelines, and the one where he left Seiya is the only good one for Cetus and Seiya, so he lives in a self-imposed exile to protect them. Anko is the main vendor for operator weapons. Getting the mote amp unlocks Chains of Harrow, which is why I recommended doing Seiya's Vigil right before Chains of Harrow, so the context of Anko being missing is fresh. It took me a second upon talking to him to put two and two together, so the reveal would probably have hit a little harder had it not been 26 hours of gameplay since I played Seiya's Vigil. Chains of Harrow is a direct sequel to The War Within, but that's not apparent immediately, as the narrative pivots a bit. The story is focused on a faction named the Red Veil, a religious organization who worships a figure named Rel, who we learn is one of the children of the Zariman, but was cast out by Margulis for being different. Chains of Harrow is about Rel haunting the Red Veil because he's been trapped in a transference loop since the end of the Old War, causing his mental state to deteriorate from void exposure. He becomes obsessed with something caused by prolonged void exposure, a voice that's indifferent, that he calls the man in the wall. Palladino, the speaker of the Veil, asks Lotus and the operator to help break Rel out of the transference loop by destroying the vessel that is chaining him to the void. After they free him, the Tenno agrees to fight the man in the wall for Rel so that he can rest after lifetimes in a transference loop. Tonally, Chains of Harrow is very different from previous story quests, as it dives much deeper into horror, embracing some themes from horror movies and games. I wasn't ever truly scared scared by Chains of Harrow, but it does nail the vibes of horror pretty well, without being focused mechanically on horror game elements like jump scares or disempowerment. Chains also doesn't demonize Rel and instead slowly reveals his situation, showing that he's just a kid who's not evil or scary, and just needs to be rescued from the void, rather than being something to fear. This is kind of important given how Rel is portrayed. From pretty early on, I got a suspicion, starting around the time Palladino said that he was cast out for being different. I started to think, based on the way Rel talks, that the thing that separates him from the other children aboard the Zariman is that he's autistic. Chains of Harrow doesn't ever come out and directly confirm this idea, and doesn't need to, given that autism is a specific pathologized diagnosis that might not exist in Warframe's universe. However, I think Rel is obviously intended to be seen as autistic. The thing that confirmed it for me is the emotion matching minigame that's a motif throughout the quest. We hear Rel talking to his mother and playing a game where he tries to recognize emotions based on drawing faces on flashcards. Having difficulty reading body language and nonverbal clues is a pretty common autistic trait, one that often causes communication difficulties when interacting with non-autistic people. The reason that I was able to recognize that Rel is autistic so quickly is that I'm autistic and saw some of myself in Rel. Having difficulty getting along with other kids, then being able to tell that there's something different about you, and being isolated or bullied because of it. That's all depressingly familiar to me. You'd hope that this ostracization wouldn't extend to adults like Margulis, but unfortunately there's a lot of stigma and misunderstanding about autism that persists in adults and often even healthcare providers that can cause people like Rel to be isolated, so that tracks. The nice thing is that Rel finds the Red Veil, who takes him in and takes him seriously, accepting him for who he is and the wisdom that he can share. I thought Warframe's depiction of autism was very nice and a bit heartwarming, which is kinda ironic given the horror theming. One thing that confused me a bit on my playthrough is the whole man in the wall situation. Because of a few lines of dialogue where Lotus is skeptical of Rel's story, I thought the man in the wall was just a transference delusion.
Well, it's just you, alone and trapped in a transference loop. Don't give in to these delusions of void exposure. There is no man in the wall.
I then interpreted the operator telling Rel they would continue his fight against them as just telling him what he needs to hear to be able to rest. Mild spoiler alert, but we will later see that it's not delusion and is in fact a real phenomenon. It also wasn't immediately obvious to me that the weird doppelganger with pure black eyes that calls the operator Kiddo was the same thing as the man in the wall. I'm not sure if this is a case of the story being too vague, or just a case of me taking Lotus's opinions too literally because I trusted her a bit too much. This confusion threw me off a bit and made me not connect the dots between Chains of Harrow and later Void stuff until Whisper in the Walls. It also could be intentionally vague, trying to make the player slowly realize that Rel was right on their own time, but obviously I don't know. Generally, Chains of Harrow continues the high bar of quality that began with Natah. Next is a quest called Apostasy Prologue, which isn't what I expected at all. Given that it's listed as a main quest, I thought it was going to be a fully fledged story like Chains of Harrow. Instead, Apostasy Prologue is a very short quest. Completing it took me less than 5 minutes. The player enters a portal from their personal quarters into the void where they follow a trail of Margulis's energy as we hear quotes from her, discovering that she was betrayed by someone named Ballas and possibly sentenced to death for apostasy, abandoning a religion and becoming a heretic. Margulis has the same voice as Lotus, which is an extension of a moment in Chains of Harrow where Palladino says,
Great sentient queen, forgive me, but what you are, what you've made of yourself, is merely drawn from the dreams of these divine children. You are not she. You are not Margulis.
Essentially, what Palladino is saying here is that Lotus acts like Margulis and has taken on her appearance and personalities based on the memories of the Tenno. This became more apparent in Apostasy Prologue, which ends with the operator witnessing Ballas finding Lotus. Ballas treats Lotus like Margulis. Lotus protests, but Ballas essentially says that she is Margulis because she's imprisoned like Margulis was. Lotus takes off her helmet as Ballas leads her away. This quest is basically just a teaser for the sacrifice, which is focused on Ballas, and also the new war, which focuses on Ballas and Lotus's relationship. I was expecting something more substantial as there's very little gameplay here, but if I had understood ahead of time that this is essentially an in-game teaser for the following quest, I think I would have had an easier time enjoying Apostasy Prologue for what it was. Concluding Arc 2 is another full-length quest called The Sacrifice, focused on the operators searching for Ballas so that they can figure out where he's taken their surrogate mother, Lotus. They have to grow up and step outside their mother's shadow. The operator sees a vision of a Warframe named Umbra trying to fight back against Ballas, only to be killed, because Umbra cannot disobey his creator. Hoping to find Ballas, the operator goes on a quest to track down and recreate this Warframe. Along the way, they discover hidden Orokin codices created by Ballas, and see memories from Umbra prior to their death. Along the way, we learn a lot about Ballas, Umbra, Warframes, the Orokin, and the Sentients. The codices are Ballas giving secrets about Warframes to the Sentients before defecting to their side, which is implied to have been decisive in the Old War. In them, we learn that Ballas created Warframes. Ballas also explains the origins of the Sentients and how they turned against the Orokin. Warframes were a weapons experiment designed to create war machines for the Orokin that failed. They couldn't be controlled and continually rebelled until the accident aboard the Zariman. Meanwhile, Umbra is stuck reliving the trauma of a terrible moment, Ballas infecting him with infestation and forcing him to kill his son in a sacrifice, as he's turned into a host, from a Dax to a Warframe. This happens likely because Umbra discovered that Ballas was planning to defect to the Sentients, so Ballas silenced him and ruthlessly killed Umbra's bloodline in the process. This is portrayed in gameplay with a minigame where the player controls Umbra, as he's forced to play a modified version of Go against Ballas. The algorithm controlling your opponent is intentionally very good at the game, excellently adding to the oppressive feeling that Umbra is being outplayed by Ballas and cannot stop his plans. The operator is able to enter Umbra's memories and help him come to terms with his trauma, accepting that killing his son wasn't his fault. This allows the operator to work with Umbra and wield him to fight Ballas. The sacrifice ends with Ballas's defeat, but the Sentient arrive and claim him, including Lotus, who we see in her original sentient form. The operator is horrified, asking what Ballas did to her, but Lotus says this is who she is, as she leaves to return to the sentient homeworld and find her mother. The sacrifice feels like the climax of a story arc, finally paying off everything that Warframe has been building towards since Natah, answering questions that quest revealed. The story is a bit complicated and I didn't understand everything at first, particularly since Ballas is a little vague about the origins of the Sentients, so I didn't realize that the Sentient were creations of the Orokin. Until the New War, I was a bit confused and thought they might have been an alien species enslaved by the Orokin. Otherwise, The Sacrifice is a very touching story about overcoming trauma, which is handled very well. I was touched by the operator's story, reaching out to help Umbra heal, which climaxed very nicely with the reveal that the thing that makes the children of the Zariman special is that they're healers, controlling others by helping them overcome their pain. In a way, if you play Warframe for escapism, the operators could be healing you too, by helping you have a little bit of respite from your pain. Balas's manipulations of Umbra and duplicitous defection sets him up perfectly as a villain, making me hate him, even more than for taking away my surrogate mother. The reveal of Natah's sentient form and that she's returning to the sentient to see her mother also hit very hard, about as hard as the Lua reveal in the second dream. The sacrifice is the perfect ending for Arc 2, showing the operator come into their own, ending with a cliffhanger teasing Arc 3 and the new war. I'm not gonna lie, I really struggled with the Orokin glyph cipher puzzles in the sacrifice, mostly because the glyphs were so difficult to keep track of due to how they seemed to have multiple different fonts that I was supposed to read to complete the puzzle. I ended up not completely understanding the puzzles and partially brute forcing them, or waiting until the game gave me a hint, because notes I copied on the back of an envelope were not very good copies, making it difficult to identify the same symbol across different fonts. Conceptually, showing off the script of the Orokin language is cool, but I struggled with how they looked in different contexts. Arc 2 actually feels like a real story arc. It tells a serialized story over 5 main parts. The story of Lotus, the Void, and the Operator. It drives towards a climax, Balas taking Lotus and the two of them leaving the Operator behind. It has several unified themes: family, parent-child relationships, overcoming trauma, and finding your identity and place in the world. I loved all 5 of those main parts because of how cohesive and consistent they felt, unlike Arc 1. It also dramatically expands the lore of Warframe's world, fleshing out the Old War and the sentient Orokin conflict. It truly is a fantastic story that I would highly recommend to anyone interested in Warframe's narrative. The saga also helped ground me in Warframe's world and understand the game. I started to feel familiar with it and understand it in a way I just didn't during Arc 1. With that understanding came benefits and drawbacks. I started to grasp build crafting and several of the abstruse systems behind it. I also started to notice the places where Warframe feels a bit samey. Because most of Warframe's levels are procedurally generated, once you play each tile set enough times, you start to notice similarities, areas that are repeated in level after level. This has the benefit of allowing digital extremes to make a lot of levels with fewer resources, but it also makes the world feel a bit smaller, and can cause spaces to have less identity than they would otherwise. I particularly felt this in the outer solar system, as I started to see tile sets reused on different planets, making each planet not feel distinct, especially the gas giants, which just feel like a series of Corpus and Grineer ships and facilities that you've been to 100 times. I would have liked a bit more sense of place and unique identity for each planet to help them feel more distinct and less repetitive. However, that sameness was mitigated a lot by the story getting to what I would consider the good stuff, the high quality and consistency of Arc 2. Arc 3 serves as the culmination of the story that begins with the Tenno reawakening. Arc 3 opens with what essentially is another teaser quest called Prelude to War, which is like Apostasy Prologue but more substantial, and I would argue more justified given the size of the quest it's a trailer for, the New War. Prelude to War has a unique structure, being split into 3 chapters: Chimera Prologue, Era, and The Maker. In total, Prelude to War is about 20 to 25 minutes long. In Chimera Prologue, the operator follows a teasing copy of themselves that's wearing Lotus's mask into the void. They have to fight through dark specters of Lotus to get to the chamber where they saw Balas take Lotus in Apostasy Prologue. This time they enter a portal into a dark place, where they hide while listening to Balas. The operator discovers that he's beginning to change due to the infestation. There's an interesting mechanic where the player has to void sling around the room to avoid being seen by Balas, in order to continue hearing his monologue. Balas seems a bit conflicted and confused, meditating on his betrayal of Margulis. Balas sees the infestation and the sentient as abominations, and yet he defected to them. This is an interesting contradiction. Chimera Prologue ends when Balas forges the blade Paracesis, the sentient layer, which the operator claims but is seen by Ballas, ending the sequence. Freaked out, the operator is returned to their ship. Era is a cutscene that shows the old war. We see Tenno and Dax fighting the sentients as they attack the reservoir. Lotus guides a series of operators to confront Era, who reveals that he's Natah's brother. He thinks the Orokin have made her a hostage. Lotus doesn't seem to recognize her brother. In response, Era blames the Makers who have captured Natah and turned her against her people. As a result, Era asks her to choose her people or the children of the Zariman. She rejects her identity as Natah, becoming the Lotus. She uses the operators to attack Era, and then the cutscene fades to the present. Aboard a sentient ship, Era has Ballas in chains, as Era talks to Natah about sentient war plans. It seems like Era is using Ballas to get his sister back, and reverse Ballas's brainwashing of Natah. The Maker is another cutscene. It's a conversation between Era and Natah. Natah thinks of her mother following up on the ending to the sacrifice. Era says that their mother is gone. Natah is confused, believing that the Lotus killed Era. However, Era says that's not true. Afterwards, Natah recognizes Ballas as a Maker. Then Era pushes her away, telling her to finish the war, the implication being that he wants her to kill the Tenno. Two of these plotlines are seemingly not continued in the new war, but I would personally like to know what happened to Natah's mother, and why Natah thinks Era should be dead. It seems like there's a story there, and almost like Era is trying to trick her somehow, but that could easily be a misread of it. The cutscene ends when Era lets go of Ballas's chains, allowing him to stand up, which foreshadows Ballas's role in the new war. The introductions in Prelude to War are complex. Era seems to be manipulating Lotus. Ballas seems to want the operator to kill Era using the paracesis so that he can be free from the sentience. Natah seems swayed by Era but doesn't entirely trust him. The man in the wall seems to be almost helping the operator. Ballas seems to have the ability to control Natah, keeping her enthralled to him, rewriting her memory and personality as he sees fit. During the old war, he made her Lotus, and at the beginning of the new war, he reverts her to Natah. Because of how complex and ambiguous this prologue was, I'm not exactly sure what a Maker is, but think it's the sentient term for the Orokin, or at least a subset of the Orokin. However, the Orokin are gone, and Ballas is one of the only ones left, so the distinction doesn't matter as much. With the benefit of hindsight, I think the name Maker is telling us that the Orokin created the sentience. I'm not 100% sure that's the intent though. I appreciate that Prelude to War gives us a lot to chew on prior to the new war. It has more going on narratively than some entire hour-long main quests. Remember that spoiler from the Deadlock Protocol that I mentioned earlier? At the very end, Parvos mentions preparing for the threat from Tau. From hindsight, my guess is that this is a reference to the return of the sentient at the start of the new war. But when I played the Deadlock Protocol, I had no idea what Tau was, or who the sentients even were, because I played it prior to Act 2. This is why I recommend playing the Deadlock Protocol after Prelude to War, so that you'll have a better chance of understanding what Parvos is talking about by the threat from Tau. The New War is the longest story quest in all of Warframe, and took me about 5.5 hours to complete. It does the same thing the War Within does, where you're locked out of the rest of the game until you beat it. The New War has the scale of a full-release AAA single-player story campaign, which is a first for Warframe. It serves as the climax of the story that's been building since Natah. The New War opens with a cutscene that I don't think can be fully appreciated until after the fact. Ballas says, "We are seasons, all of us, growing in the light, fading in the dark. at once the same, yet ever changed. While Ballas is speaking, we see infested Ballas holding his uncorrupted self. Then we see Natah holding Lotus, and finally, the operator standing alone. Obviously, this cutscene is returning to the theme of dualism that Ballas mentions in the codices from the Sacrifice, where Warframe and Operator are two halves of one whole, by showing a series of characters who have undergone a kind of identity transformation. Ballas becoming infested and defecting from the Orokin to the sentient, Natah becoming the Lotus, and the Operator, who was a child changed by the Void aboard the Zariman and gained mastery of the Void, able to control other living beings. You might think that a Warframe should be shown next to the Operator, but there isn't one. Instead, the Operator's loneliness on screen, in conjunction with the theme of dual identity, hints at one of the big narrative reveals to come in the new war, the existence of the Drifter. This is extremely clever foreshadowing that I didn't notice until I was looking back at my gameplay to write this review. The first mission of the new war isn't what I expected at all. A cutscene shows the sentients ravaging the area around Cetus, and cuts to a single Grineer who survives their ship crashing. The POV slowly rotates into the third-person perspective that Warframe uses for gameplay, and the Grineer's name, Call 175, covers the screen, like the chapter title that signifies a new point of view character in a book. For the first time, the player controls a character other than the Operator or one of their Warframes. They control a Grineer soldier fighting back against the sentients. The way the cutscene blends into the gameplay is incredibly slick editing that adds to the sense of immersion, and controlling Call emphasizes the level of the sentient threat. Normally the player fights the Grineer, but the sentient invasion is such a grave threat that they must fight alongside their enemies to save the Origin system. Unexpected alliances will be forged in the crucible of the new war, the same as the old war. Focusing on Call also serves to humanize the Grineer, who have mostly existed as faceless enemies to mow down using your Warframe. The new war elevates them to what they really are, soldiers being manipulated by their leaders, who at the end of the day are just people like you and me. Call also plays very differently than a Warframe or even the Operator. He doesn't walk very fast and doesn't have void powers to rely on. Instead, he has a Gurkhata, a machete, grenades, and a dream. The slower speed emphasizes the threat of the sentients, making it difficult for the player to breeze through them as they would in normal Warframe combat. This theme continues in the next level, which begins with a cutscene that zooms in on the face of a Corpus engineer, showing his face and humanizing him, then cuts to an over-the-shoulder shot that does the same trick as the Call opening, telling us that this engineer's name is Viso. Gameplay for Viso is some of the most unique in all of Warframe. His weapons are very weak, and instead his core gameplay loop focuses on commanding Corpus bots to take out enemies and complete tasks. There's a Breacher Moa whose job is to run up to an enemy or piece of debris and blow it up. There's a shield drone who can shield you and your other bots. And finally, a striker Moa that essentially acts like a mobile turret that you can command to shoot specific enemies. I found this idea conceptually cool, but a bit frustrating in practice, as it was sometimes difficult to get the bots to do exactly what I was trying to get them to do. Relying on the bots' AI to complete combat encounters could be a bit frustrating, especially when they decided to take a suboptimal route and get themselves killed, or their pathfinding caused them to get stuck somewhere. It was pretty satisfying when I did execute commands with them though. The plot of this level is focused around Alad V trying to get Viso to gain the command override for the Corpus fleet in the face of the sentient attack. The mission ends with a Jackal boss fight, a repeat of the Venus World boss, but with Viso instead of a Warframe. I got stuck on this fight because I didn't understand how the mechanics worked, given that it had been approximately 50 hours of gameplay since I last fought the Jackal, and I had forgotten how it worked. What you're supposed to do is use the Striker Moa to destroy one of the legs of the Jackal, which prompts the beam attack. Then you're supposed to direct the Striker to destroy the shields which are vulnerable during the beam attack. This will cause the Jackal to fall onto the floor. At this point, you need to send the Breacher Moa in to explode on the boss, which will take out half of its health. Viso also has dialogue that's supposed to teach the player what to do, but somehow in the first minute I was in the boss fight, I was able to accidentally luck my way into depleting the first half of the boss's health without understanding the shield component, leaving me to spend the next half hour confused about how to complete the second phase. Looking at my gameplay footage, I honestly can't tell exactly what happened. The boss has full shields 1 second, then the next they're gone, even though none of my attacks hit the boss. In my gameplay, the boss does its ground wave attack, which hits my Breacher Moa and kills it. Even though the shield is at full health and my Moa was too far away to hit, somehow the Jackal's shields are instantly depleted, allowing me to send in the Breacher Moa to finish the first phase. I've watched the footage like 10 times and still am confused. Additionally, the way I broke the leg the first time was sending in the Breacher Moa, so I thought that's what I needed to do first for the second phase. However, as I learned over the course of the next half hour, it doesn't seem to be possible to break one of the legs using the Breacher Moa during the second phase, even if you use the shield drone to get it across the electrified floor without dying. It kept doing 0 damage to the legs that were still damageable for some reason. I don't know why this works in phase 1, but not phase 2. I wasn't able to figure out that I needed to use the Striker Moa to break the leg until I looked up online what I was supposed to do after getting very frustrated. I think in order for learning how to beat this boss in this specific level to feel satisfying, the behavior needs to be consistent in both phases. If you can't use the Moa to blow up the legs in phase 2, it shouldn't work in phase 1. Looking at my gameplay, I honestly can't tell if the fight is working as intended or not. Am I supposed to be able to use the Breacher Moa to blow up the legs in phase 2? And what happened to the shield in phase 1? Regardless of what's actually happening behind the scenes here, I had a very frustrating and unintuitive time fighting this boss. I'm not really sure what you could do to make it better though. The end of Viso's level has a twist. It turns out Viso has been helping Alid V betray the board by negotiating a surrender to the sentient, while also making money for himself, which he didn't tell Viso. When Viso realizes this, he takes matters into his own hands and has the ship fire, blowing up one of the sentient ships. Afterwards, the cutscene transitions to the next level by panning across the space battle to the player's railjack. They attack the sentient mothership to give Teshin an entrance so that he can go in and disable the Orphix fields, allowing the Tenno to use their Warframe inside. I want to compliment how seamless most of the transitions between levels are in the new war. The use of cutscenes is extremely artful. The railjack level didn't really make much of an impression on me because it's very short, taking me about 6 minutes to beat. Seeing the massive space battle unfolding before me was a cool spectacle though. The 4th level has the player control Teshin aboard the ship as he fights to clear it, so that the Tenno can safely come aboard. Teshin has an interesting gameplay mechanic, where you can change between the 3 elemental types his swords use: heat, cold, and electricity. There are certain sentients throughout the level that have shields that you need to match the energy type of to damage. I like this mechanic a lot, but it can be a bit difficult if you are trying to attack multiple sentients with different energy types and one of them kept blocking the one that you were aligned with. Teshin also doesn't have a typical ranged weapon, and instead can throw one of his swords and grapple to it, which I thought was pretty cool. I found Teshin very satisfying to control. He does his thing and clears the Orphix field, only to be taunted by Ballas afterwards. Then a cutscene plays where the Teshin and the operator confront Ballas and try to rescue Lotus. Ballas tries to use a mask called a veil to pacify Teshin, distorting his memory and creating pain so that he can be controlled. However, this doesn't fully work, and Teshin is able to take the mask off. Ballas creates a portal into the void to send Lotus through and kill her. The operator grabs her hand trying to save her. Lotus asks to be let go, but the operator refuses, so Ballas cuts off Lotus's hand, causing her to fall into the portal. Then he stabs the operator, sending them into the portal.
You cannot kill the devil, Tenno. But you can send it back to hell.
Ballas then becomes the ruler of a new faction called the Narmer, taking control of the Origin system by placing veils on the heads of those who would resist, pacifying them. He proclaims that the Tenno shall never return. In some excellent visual storytelling, this final quote is said as we watch a mysterious hooded figure depart from a ship on Earth. We control them in the next mission, but no name pops up on screen, leaving their identity a mystery. Almost immediately I thought this was the operator, given the black robes are similar to the flight suit the operator wears in the second dream. Then a distorted voice speaks that I could immediately tell was just a mysterious Ortis, and a voice responds that's very similar to the operator's but slightly different.
Smiled himself. Full detachment veils on.
Comms are bad tonight. How many prisoners, you think?
I thought I knew right away what was going on, but the truth is a little stranger. This character has a pistol, an electric knife, and 3 abilities: health restoration, a smoke bomb, and a ping ability that lets you see enemies through walls. They sneak through a Grineer camp, but all of the Grineer are wearing veils. This character's vulnerability level felt more like Viso than the Tenno to me, forcing me to rely more heavily on stealth, which was another nice change of pace. The climax of the level commits to disempowerment, as the vault is inhabited by an Archon, a powerful monster that you can't damage and instead need to escape. If you get hit by one of its attacks, you instantly die. After escaping and being rescued, we hear dialogue from Nora Knight, revealing that it's been a while since the Tenno left, and a new character has taken up the mantle of protecting the people of the Origin system, called the Drifter. The Drifter returns to their camp, which is aboard a landed version of the Tenno's ship. They go to the somatic link where we see a decaying version of Lotus, who takes off the Drifter's hood, revealing that they're the operator, but no longer a child. Ortis calls the Drifter the operator, but they ask not to be called that. I was excited to see the adult version of the operator. It made me think that years had passed under the veil of Narmer's influence, and that they had grown up hardened by the Narmer occupation. There's also the implication that they don't have transference powers yet, which made me think that somehow Ballas sending them into the void removed them, which is true from a certain point of view. The Drifter and Ortis have Lotus's body and want to heal her, but don't know how. The Drifter wants to ask someone for help, but Ortis says they need a Corpus ship to slip through the Narmer blockade. Naturally, the Drifter sneaks into Fortuna to steal one. The intro to this level features the long elevator ride down from Vox Solaris, but this time the workers are veiled and sing the praises of Narmer in a haunting song that somehow tops the original Fortuna intro. It hits the darker tone of the new war perfectly, as there isn't hope right now. Instead, the song is solemn. The Solaris have resigned themselves to Ballas's control, unable to see through the veil that is altering their understanding of reality.
Heed the ruler of us all. For we're all
In the Vox Solaris musical sequence, the camera is continuously panning up towards the higher levels of Fortuna as the Solaris sing, symbolizing their hope, rising towards the sky. During the Fornarmer sequence, the camera tracks with the elevator, constantly moving down, symbolizing the Solaris' descent towards hell under Balas's occupation. In an interesting twist, in order to get past security, the Drifter has to wear a veil and have their thoughts corrupted. They receive visions that seek to manipulate them, turn them against Lotus, and towards Balas. In this rewriting of reality, Balas positions himself as saving you from fake nightmares of Zariman created by Lotus. This shows very viscerally how the veils work. They try to isolate the victim by turning them against whoever they love and care about, and replace those loved ones with Balas, creating a false reality where the only person they need is their benevolent king. Balas keeps his power through brainwashing and mind control, as he knows that very few would willingly follow him. Instead, the Narmer are all in various states of veil-induced psychosis. The Drifter gets their ship, frees themselves from their veil, and goes to Uranus to see Hunhao. The Drifter is bold, walking right into Hunhao's lair and letting the stalker almost kill them, just to have a conversation, trying to get Hunhao to help them save his daughter. The conversation between Hunhao and the Drifter is one of my favorite moments in the New War. The Drifter is reckless, antagonizing Hunhao even when he holds a knife to their throat. Hunhao respects that and reveals he shares the Drifter's goal, to save his daughter. He tells the Drifter to kill the Archons and use their power to resurrect Lotus. Hunhao also gives the Drifter Natah, a fire bow, which is one of my favorite weapons in the game. It causes an explosion on impact and is generally very strong. It made subsequent levels much easier than when I just had a pistol, because even though I couldn't use my Warframe, I still felt more powerful. You might think that the rest of the campaign would be straightforward. Kill the 3 Archons, resurrect Lotus, confront Balas. That's what I thought was going to happen and is essentially the structure of the last few missions. However, before doing that, the story takes an unexpected diversion. The next level takes place in the Void, traveling into the past, a memory from the Zariman, showing what the operator's life was like before the Void jump accident. We see the children in one of their classes, complete with indoctrination via unquestioningly repeating a loyalty oath to the ruling government, which really cast me back to my time in the American public school system. The students learn about temporal axioms, how time works in Warframe. The lecture and subsequent pop quiz are proctored by an Entrati. Making the player listen to a short lecture and then take a quiz is an ingenious way to teach lore concepts, because it forces you to remember, so that in the future the timeline paradoxes and manipulations become easier to understand. It also helps that the quiz was very easy. You can even move through the lesson slides at your own pace. This is genius game design that creates an optimal learning environment. The lesson focuses on 2 theories of time, presentism and eternalism. Presentism is the idea that the present is the only thing that's real. The past and future cannot be accessed, so they don't tangibly exist. Time evolves linearly towards the future. Eternalism is the idea that all points in time exist equally and can be relativistically accessed. According to the lecture, the Void proves this idea is true and presentism is false. Warframe didn't invent these 2 concepts, merely adopting existing philosophy for their sci-fi world. The lecture even borrows a common analogy for eternalism, the universe as a block of 4-dimensional spacetime. In our reality, presentism is probably not accurate, because the physics of Einstein's theories of general and special relativity show that observers in different reference frames will experience the flow of time and chronology in a different order. Both these theories are immensely successful and have been verified in a number of observations of astronomical phenomena. Gravity and speed change the way an observer experiences time, making their clocks tick at different rates. A clock moves slower the more gravity it experiences or the faster speed through space it travels at. Thus, an event can be viewed as happening at different points in the histories of various observers because of the relative differences in their reference frames. This could be interpreted as disproving presentism because what constitutes the present is different depending on what reference frame you're in. Space and time aren't linear. Instead, they combine into a four-dimensional geometry where time behaves more like a spatial dimension. This means, in theory, if you found yourself in an extreme geometry with negative curvature, you could travel to the past rather than the future. In relativity, past and future exist alongside the present. However, we have no definitive evidence of these geometries existing in our universe, as they often require exotic physics of unknown veracity for the math to work out. Personally, I'm not comfortable saying that relativity definitively proves eternalism is the correct philosophical framework for time, because that's more of a philosophical interpretation of the physical theory, but it does suggest that ideas like eternalism are much more likely to be correct than presentism. My hesitance comes from the fact that there could be a future theory of physics that proves eternalism incorrect. Then you would need another philosophy to supersede it. Warframe uses the fact that our experiences tend to bias presentism to its favor. Humans experience time linearly, and the present is the only point in time that feels tangibly accessible to us. Thus, it's a bit harder to wrap your head around the idea that presentism probably isn't true. Relativistic effects on our day-to-day lives tend to be extremely small, to the point of us not being able to notice them. Thus, our brains haven't needed to evolve an instinctual understanding of relativistic effects. Warframe takes the idea of eternalism to some logical extremes by invoking paradoxes allowing multiple conflicting chronologies to exist simultaneously. This does have some basis in physics, as it evokes ideas from quantum mechanics such as quantum entanglement and quantum superposition. After the pop quiz, we witness the beginning of the void jump accident before cutting to black. Next, the player chooses the first Archon to fight. Upon defeating them, the Drifter uses its crystal to partially heal Lotus. She freaks out, and then another vignette from the Zariman plays. We see the operator barricading the door to the classroom while chaos unfolds outside, the adults taken by the madness of the void. It's cool to see stories referred to in the second dream played out on screen. The operator talks to the various children in the classroom, trying to comfort them and help them during this traumatic event. Then they approach a final student, their doppelganger, who does the characteristic creepy man-in-the-wall thing. Then the same routine repeats. Kill an Archon, bring the crystal to Lotus, she freaks out again, cut back to the Zariman. This time the man-in-the-wall offers the operator a deal. It can save all of the children, but the operator has to want it. This vignette is interrupted by violence in the Drifter's camp. Lotus attacks the Drifter, seeing the Tenno as evil, reverting back to her past as the narrative explores the operator and Drifters. The player has to escape Lotus's attack, but eventually Lotus finds and grabs their neck, returning them to the memories of the Zariman. The operator shakes the hand of the man-in-the-wall, then experiences a vision of different versions of them across multiple possible timelines. In the end, two remain, the Drifter and the operator. The vision of the Zariman seems to imply that the reason the children gained powers was that the operator made a deal with the man-in-the-wall that allowed the children to survive and gain void powers. The man-in-the-wall appears to have a very deep role in the creation of the Tenno. The Drifter pulls on the operator's void power and uses it to fight back against Lotus. This changes them to the operator, a child again, which causes Lotus to recognize them. Then, she leaves to confront Ballas. Instead of immediately having the player follow Lotus or fight the third Archon, the gameplay returns to the Zariman. The operator follows Shadows and Voices to their personal quarters, where they meet the Drifter and have a chat. The operator is freaked out and confused, serving as a proxy for the player, so the Drifter explains what's going on. The two of them are the same person from two different timelines. The operator is a child because they were rescued from the Zariman after the accident. The Drifter is an adult because they weren't rescued and grew up aboard the ruins of the Zariman. Where they were is covered in the Duviri Paradox. The Drifter and the Operator are two different versions of the same person allowed to coexist because of eternalism and a resulting paradox. The flashbacks are equally motivated by eternalism. Those points in history exist just as real as the present of the New War, which is very thematically resonant and a creative way to justify exposition. The Operator and Drifter find themselves in the strange situation of needing to learn to coexist dually, paying off the theme foreshadowed in the opening cutscene. The player is forced to choose who will chase Lotus and confront Ballas, the Operator or the Drifter. I chose the Drifter because they had been taking out the Archons so far, so I thought they were best equipped to confront Ballas. Also, I'm of the opinion that in the real world we should shield children from experiencing true violence when possible, so it seemed better for the adult to handle it. After this choice, the Drifter learns to control Warframes via transference, and is empowered for the final confrontation with Ballas and Lotus. I have huge respect for the New War's commitment to disempowerment. Going into the New War, the player is used to the status quo where they have immense power, the ability to use the Void and control Warframes via transference. In order to tell a compelling story involving losing that power temporarily, the game needs to fully commit to disempowering the player and forcing them to solve problems without it for a while. Doing this makes regaining the power even more satisfying because you now know what it's like to solve problems without it for an extended period. This is why I love the fact that the first 4.5 hours of the New War are committed to disempowering the player. In the beginning, making them use other characters who aren't as powerful like Kal, Viso, and Teshin, and for the rest by controlling the Drifter who doesn't have transference powers yet, because they weren't rescued from the Zariman, so they haven't learned to harness the Void fully yet, under the tutelage of Margulis. This makes the ending feel much more satisfying. It also fits the themes of the story well. Ballas disempowers the Operator in order to take Lotus's child away and stop their opposition to his plans to dominate the system. He sends them back to Hell, creating the paradox where the Drifter exists, never getting rescued, and has to find a way to survive in isolation aboard the Zariman. Unknowingly, Ballas creates the Drifter just as he created the Tenno, which ends up being his downfall. Eternalism dictates that Ballas can never truly kill the Operator. They're too connected to the Void and exist at various points in the past and in alternate timelines, so he can only rewrite their history to make their life more hellish. Eternalism also implies that nobody can ever truly die in Warframe, as versions of them will always exist at earlier points in history and in alternate timeline scenarios. I also like that the New War pretty effectively uses eternalism to deal with a storytelling trap that I call the tyranny of the status quo. In large franchises, there's a bias towards the status quo. If you change the world too much, it threatens the existence of other parts of the franchise. However, this is in conflict with good storytelling, as the best stories often require characters and the world to change. Our real world is never static. The world changes day after day, year after year. People grow and evolve based on their experiences. However, the bias towards the status quo dictates that to avoid throwing everything that currently exists in the franchise away, the status quo can't change too much. This feels bad because it often weakens the impact of major changes to the world, and limits what stories can possibly be told in the series. I would argue that the tyranny of the status quo is most present in live service video games like Warframe. They have a bunch of gameplay activities that need to remain evergreen, so they don't feel invalid if you play them again after various story quests like the New War. This means that it's often difficult for the storytellers to do something that breaks the status quo, as it would fundamentally change that existing gameplay content, because it's tied to the existence of certain characters and gameplay features. Warframe partially gets around this problem by locking the player out of the rest of the game during major story quests that shake up the status quo, like the War Within and the New War. However, there was a feeling in the back of my mind that all of these major changes to the status quo, like being disempowered, Lotus dying, the rise of the Narmer, and the operator's history being rewritten couldn't stay for long without invalidating existing gameplay systems and content. However, Eternalism is Digital Extremes' ace in the hole. Moments in the past that are dissonant with the current present still exist because of Eternalism. That reversion to the status quo becomes motivated by the rules of the world rather than arbitrary external factors. Changes to the status quo also feel less cheap and more satisfying if they're allowed time to breathe. If, for a hypothetical example, the operator lost the ability to control warframes for a single mission, then got it back right away, the change wouldn't feel as impactful, so committing to several hours of gameplay without it helps the change feel more real. Eternalism doesn't completely solve the status quo issue, as Warframe still continually reverts to the status quo after major quests, but I think it does a much better job being aware of and working with that limitation than I've seen in comparable franchises. In the final hour of the new war, the player fights through the Narmer and Sentience, following Lotus on her journey to confront Ballas. It's also revealed that Ballas wants to destroy the sun in order to use the Void to get to Tau. I'm not gonna lie, this whole aspect of Ballas's plans felt like it came out of nowhere and could have used a bit more build-up and explanation. The player even allies with Era, who has realized that Ballas was using him for the Tau plan, and destroying the sun isn't worth it, so he now fights to stop Ballas. This pays off the foreshadowing from Prelude to War, where we see that Ballas doesn't actually truly like the sentience. Era helps the player get to the final Archon, so that they can use its crystal to finish rebuilding Lotus. The Drifter defeats the Archon, then reaches Ballas just behind Lotus. However, Ballas crushes the crystal, destroying the Drifter's plan. The Ballas boss fight is incredibly thematically resonant. Ballas controls Lotus, making her attack the player, and the main mechanic revolves around redirecting Ballas and Lotus's attacks to hurt Ballas, weakening him. His creations and manipulations of others are doomed to be his undoing. Ballas becomes vengeful and angry, lashing out at Lotus and the Drifter. He injures the Drifter, then stabs Lotus, blaming her for all of his problems. However, he lingers on Lotus for a bit too long, allowing the Drifter to place a veil over his eyes. Ballas's vision gives up the whole game concerning Lotus. He sees Lotus as Margulis and has created her from Natah to be the Margulis that he couldn't have, the one he betrayed. The woman who never loved him back. Everything has been about Ballas's unrequited love for Margulis. Lotus then has Ballas kiss her and uses it to Sic Semper Tyrannis Ballas and suck the life force out of him from the crystal to rebuild herself. Then, in the most baffling moment of the whole campaign, a portal to the Void opens and the man on the wall comes out as a giant statue, and their operator doppelganger form. Lotus holds them at bay until they return to the Void. This presumably is setting up the next story arc, the Void War Saga. At the very end, the operator reaches out to Lotus and asks her how she feels. Lotus realizes that she has three voices, Natah, Margulis, and their fusion, the Lotus. She doesn't know which one she is, as her identity is fractured upon rebirth. The operator suggests choosing one to lead them. Diegetically, Lotus decides, but in gameplay the player is asked to choose between the three. This was probably the most difficult choice Warframe has ever asked me to make. I wasn't sure who Lotus should be and how she should go forward. I wanted her to make that choice for herself, not me. I felt especially conflicted given the identity issues I've had and transitions I've undergone personally. Obviously, Lotus's sci-fi version of this is different from me transitioning, but at the same time, it does feel kind of similar. However, I also felt like returning to Natah would erase all of Lotus's growth and change. At the same time, being Lotus would just relegate her to the same personality she's had the entirety of the first three arcs. Finally, Lotus is Ballas's recreation of Margulis and couldn't perfectly be that person he lost, so her trying to be that feels a bit wrong. None of the options felt great to me, but I thought that Lotus deserved to continue on in spite of her fractured identity. Ultimately, I decided to go with Margulis, because that's the only of the 3 identities Lotus had never been before, and I wanted to allow her to change. I also somewhat selfishly wanted to know what Margulis was like, given that she was executed long before Warframe's gameplay begins. I also considered the fact that I thought Margulis could be a good mother figure for the operator, and by proxy, me, the player. Still, I felt very conflicted about it and still worry about it given that it's a permanent choice. The New War is probably my favorite quest in all of Warframe. It has such an epic scale and compelling story that I'm willing to look past its very few faults. My hope for the future of Warframe is to see more quests like the New War on that epic scale. In particular, I hope Arc 4 can create a conclusion that manages to top the New War, but I'm not sure if that's possible. When I unlocked Uranus Junction and was finally about to start Natah, I suddenly unlocked the Duviri Paradox, and the game suggested I do that next. I deliberately avoided it so that I could play it during Arc 3 right after the New War, in accordance with the order on the quest guide. However, by making this choice, I had to endure pop-ups pretty much every time I logged in, telling me that the Duviri Paradox was available to play, sometimes most annoyingly during cutscenes for other quests. I wish there was a way to mute these pop-ups after seeing them a few times. After finally playing the Duviri Paradox, I looked into why this quest is suggested so early. Apparently, new players used to have the option to start with the Duviri Paradox instead of Vor's Prize, but as far as I can tell, this hasn't been the case for a couple of years now. I also accidentally stumbled on some posts arguing about whether the quest should be recommended to new players early or not. Personally, I think that suggesting this quest prior to the New War is a bad idea from a narrative perspective. This is because the Duviri Paradox follows the Drifter, so the player will have the Drifter reveal from the New War spoiled if they do it earlier. Additionally, the Drifter controls Warframes in Duviri, so you would potentially be spoiling the second Dream Operator reveal, which I think needs to be preserved because it's one of the best narrative moments in the whole game. I'm not sure how the game handles it if you play Duviri first, but getting the character creation screen prior to playing the second dream would be a huge tragedy. However, I understand why this quest is recommended to new players from a gameplay perspective, though. After completing the Duviri Paradox, players gain access to the Circuit activity, which allows a deterministic path to unlock a Warframe each week. Getting access to that activity early would help new players get a head start on expanding their Warframe collection. However, I think this completely messes up the story, so I think new players should be warned about this. This could be as simple as providing a spoiler warning saying that the Duviri Paradox may spoil elements of the second dream and the New War. I never clicked on the Duviri Paradox to avoid spoilers, so I don't know if there is a spoiler warning the player needs to acknowledge, but I think implementing this is very necessary if you're going to make the quest available so early. I also saw the argument that the story concerns don't matter because new players are supposed to be confused when they're newly awakened, and the Duviri Paradox is a confusing story anyways. I don't mean any disrespect to anyone who believes this, but I think this is a very bad argument. Addressing the first part, yes, being confused about the world of Warframe helps the second dream twist hit harder, but potentially spoiling it in Duviri basically cancels out any benefit. Also, I don't think being confused is actually a good thing, because it can push players away who become frustrated by the lack of answers, or seem like a cop-out to excuse incoherent storytelling. The second dream twist would work the best if the player has an established understanding of the world of Warframe that's completely upended by the twist. Yes, the twist still works despite this and is satisfying, but it doesn't negate prior storytelling failures. Finally, and the point I think is most important, is that the Duviri Paradox is actually quite straightforward and easy to understand if you play it with proper context. My reading of the Duviri Paradox, based on playing it directly after the New War, is that it tells us the origin story of the Drifter and how they came to escape the Void and Zariman. Given that we hear the audio of Ballast stabbing the operator and throwing them into the Void early on in the Duviri Paradox,
But you can't send it back to hell.
my assumption is that the Duviri Paradox is intended to be seen as taking place between that cutscene and the first mission of the New War where we play as the Drifter. Because the New War tells us that the Drifter is the version of the operator that wasn't rescued from the Zariman and grew up there, and the twist at the end of the Duviri Paradox that reveals the Drifter was in control the whole time, I interpret Duviri as a void dream world that the Drifter subconsciously creates to cope with their trauma of being stuck aboard the Zariman after the Void Jump accident. It's still a causal paradox given that it contains elements from the Drifter's future in the New War, namely Teshin and Warframes, but one that's propped up by eternalism. Additionally, the Drifter has a voice line in the New War where they say,
I should have stayed in Duviri.
which I found confusing at first, but retroactively explains this chronology. The Duviri Paradox then becomes a metaphor for the Drifter's trauma and dissociation, a world that they need to cope with being stranded and left for dead, but one they cannot escape until they accept their traumatic experience. They paradoxically escape by letting go of that need to escape their situation. I liked that Duviri was a paradox that I had to piece together with evidence from both itself and the New War quest, and found it satisfyingly simple to understand once I reached the ending. If you're missing all that New War context, it will make Duviri essentially impossible to interpret and understand. I'm guessing I was more primed to understand the story than the average person, given that I have a passion for thematic storytelling and I have a history of trauma and dissociation, so I don't know how easy the story would be to understand for someone without an underlying knowledge of how all those things work. The only failing of the Duviri Paradox is I think the implementation of the sword fighting and parry mechanics in the main quest itself. I don't actually think they're implemented poorly, but I very quickly discovered I didn't actually need to combo them effectively as long as I held block and then shot the knights who were telegraphing that they were about to do their ult attack. Otherwise, I could just spam block until I could use my ult, or just shoot them until they died. I think the sword combat needed to be a bit more difficult to encourage carefully engaging with the sword fighting mechanics. I haven't spent a ton of time playing Duviri post-quest content other than the circuit yet, so it's possible that there are higher difficulties that actually reward mastery of those mechanics. However, in terms of implementation, when I was actually trying to engage with the mechanics and chain together combos, I found them very satisfying to achieve. If you look at Arc 3, it barely looks like an arc. There are 3 entries, one of which is a 25-minute prologue, so there's only actually 2 major entries. However, only one of those entries actually progresses the main plot, so in effect, Arc 3 is the New War plus supplemental material. This is not to disparage the Duviri Paradox, as I actually quite liked it, and don't think a story needs to progress the main plot to be impactful and do something well, but it by nature is a self-contained story existing in the middle of the New War, explaining where the Drifter was prior to leaving the Zariman. As a result, Arc 3 is much more of a thematic arc than a plot-focused arc. The New War Saga is effectively the Eternalism arc, the arc interested in unpacking time paradoxes, chronology, dualism, and identity. By length, it's roughly the same as Arc 2, which is why I think it does make sense to wrap into its own arc. However, I do think it can be argued that the New War is actually the conclusion to the first real arc, given that Arc 2 ends on a cliffhanger. Can you tell I find the organization of this arc system baffling? In terms of quality, I think Arc 3 is the most consistently good arc Warframe has to offer. Every quest is among the best, and there are no weak entries. Granted, a lot of that weight is being carried by the epic scope and excellent execution of the New War, but that praise is deserved. Around Arc 3, I started crafting a lot of the weapon blueprints I had received from quests, random drops, and the market, but ran into a limitation of Warframe's early game. Apparently, each player starts out with a limited number of weapon slots, which I very quickly maxed out. This meant anytime I wanted a new weapon, I would have to sell an old one. However, the main way you get XP for the mastery system is by leveling up weapons in Warframes for the first time, so if you want to optimally gain mastery rank, you need to max out each weapon before selling it. This creates a massive bottleneck in acquiring new weapons for a new player, and most of the time I have several weapons that are done crafting, but I can't claim because I don't have the space for them. Warframe does allow you to get more weapon slots, but this is primarily done through the premium currency Platinum that you purchase for real money. There are a few ways to get more slots, like from the free battle pass system called Nightwave, but this also takes a lot of time. It would be nice to have more slots, but I don't have the disposable income to buy Platinum right now, so I have to rely on free methods for the time being. After the Duviri Paradox, I played Angels of the Zariman, which isn't listed as part of Arcs 3 or 4 on the quest guide, but released between the New War and the Duviri Paradox. However, I think playing Angels after Duviri makes the most sense, given how connected the New War and the Duviri Paradox are. I'm listing Angels of the Zariman as part of Arc 4 because the wiki does, and the fact that Angels is focused on void corruption, which is what Arc 4 is about. I think not listing Angels of the Zariman and Jade Shadows on the quest guide is a mistake. Yes, technically they don't progress the main plot, but I think they need to exist in some kind of category for each arc that lists the non-main plot relevant quests, also including the side quests and Warframe quests. The current implementation of the arc system is too arcane and unapproachable. I shouldn't have to spend extra time looking into release dates to figure out when it would be best to play a particular quest. I think the game should just make that apparent and obvious for me. I also delayed playing Angels of the Zariman because of a misunderstanding. Instead, I did 7 hours worth of side quests and tried to level up my rank with Onko, because there was a pop-up when I tried to start Angels of the Zariman that told me that the mote amp is not very good, and that having a stronger operator weapon to do the quest is recommended. Because the game didn't really explain mote amps and how to change them, at the time I didn't realize that I'd already unlocked Sirocco. The warning pop-up specifically mentioned Sirocco, but because of the way it was worded, I thought that that was just the best possible amp that I could use for the quest, and didn't realize that the game was trying to tell me I already had unlocked it. As a result, I looked up online how to get a better mote amp, and read a post that said I needed to go build one with Onko, which led to me spending a ton of time in the plains of Eidolon trying to get sentient cores to rank him up. I found this kind of frustrating because the mote amp does indeed suck, and is difficult to kill Vomvalists with. Eventually, I looked at my operator options and realized that I already had Sirocco, which made me feel kinda dumb, so I equipped it and immediately started Angels of the Zariman. A little pop-up screen after I unlocked Sirocco telling me that I've unlocked my second mote amp and this is how I equip it would have saved me the confusion. The Angels pop-up also could have explicitly said, a stronger mote amp like Sirocco, which you already have unlocked, is recommended. This would have told me, oh, I just need to figure out how to equip Sirocco. Angels of the Zariman makes the Zariman a fully playable location with combat and missions. The story focuses on the crew of the Zariman who have been resurrected by the Void and need to fight back against a mysterious song that's infecting the ship. The Drifter is sent back into Hell by Lotus to protect the ship from being overrun by Void monsters. I think the implication is supposed to be that we're protecting the Zariman from the Man in the Wall, but that wasn't super clear to me when I was playing the quest, given that it came before Whispers in the Wall, which is when I realized the connection. I also think if I'm understanding correctly, the Drifter's past is under threat from void corruption, which would disrupt their ability to do transference, so we're trying to protect their chronology from being overwritten. I appreciated that Angels of the Zariman expands upon the history of the Zariman, its crew, and what it represented to the people caught in the accident. The Zariman was supposed to be a new hope for the Origin system, which makes what happened even more tragic. Overall, I enjoyed Angels of the Zariman, but found it a bit muddled. I'm guessing I'll understand it a bit better when I start looking into the lore. However, I wish Angels of the Zariman would have stood on its own a bit better as a quest. I appreciated that Angels of the Zariman has very challenging combat compared to previous story quests, and integrates both the Warframe and Drifter into combat effectively. There also was an interesting tower defense aspect to some of the missions, and I'm a big enjoyer of horde modes, wave-based survival, and tower defense aspects, so I thought that was super fun. Whispers in the Walls is the beginning of Arc 4's main story. It returns to Deimos, where apparently Albrecht Entrati has hidden a lab from his descendants beneath the Necrolisk. Everyone and everything in this lab is dripped out in gold, ancient Egypt style. Whispers in the Walls focuses on Albrecht's plan for the future called the Kalimos sequence. It involves waking up the original version of Lloyd, a human who apparently hates constructs, and then guides the Tenno to uncover Albrecht's plans. The whole sequence is an elaborate plan to outsmart something called the Indifference by sending Albrecht back to an alternate reality version of 1999. I was initially a bit confused by the Indifference and wrote a note while I was playing that said, "Is there a connection between Rel and his Man on the Wall and the Indifference?" The answer to that question is yes, they are one and the same. It took me a bit to make that connection, given how the Indifference has appeared time and time again in Warframe, dating back to the War Within, but with little context or explanation. The Tenno uses Albrecht's machine to control someone in 1999 via transference and find Entrati, but they arrive late, a few minutes before midnight. Thus, they need to fight the Indifference in the present and figure out how to return to an earlier point in 1999 so that they can help Albrecht fight the Indifference there. After this reveal, I jokingly wrote down another note that said, "We doing Void time travel to 1999? I hope they're prepared for Y2K. As it turns out, that's exactly what Warframe 1999 is about, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I found Whispers in the Walls' gameplay engaging, but thought its story was a bit confusing. I could have used a bit more explanation about why Albrecht is fighting the Indifference, and what the Indifference actually is, to better understand the stakes of what's going on. Whatever the Indifference is, it's bad enough to scare Albrecht, causing him to declare war against it and flee to 1999 to keep his family safe. I did find the temporary resolution, keeping the Indifference at bay using love, to be an inspired choice. Personally, I think the opposite of love is not actually hate, as both are equally passionate. Instead, I think apathy or indifference is the opposite of love, because it's about not caring at all what happens to another person or being, when love is about caring deeply about them. Using love to counter indifference is a very interesting thematic idea that I would love to see explored more. Aesthetically and musically, Whispers in the Walls was very enjoyable. I think it has one of the best soundtracks in all of Warframe, which is a huge compliment coming from me, and the stone gold Egyptian aesthetic is a nice change of pace. It serves as a good start to Arc 4, but again I thought it needed a bit more setup for me to fully appreciate it. At the end, I felt like I was missing something, and if I was genuinely missing something, I think the game should have directed me to that so that I have the best experience playing the story as possible. However, it is possible that you're not supposed to fully understand what's going on, as Whispers in the Walls is about uncovering the meaning behind the Kalimos sequence. I just wish the ending had explained a little bit more to make that mystery feel like it was paid off better. I played Jade Shadows between Whispers in the Walls and the Lotus Eaters because I knew that's when it was released. The quest guide doesn't list it as part of Arc 4 because it doesn't continue the main plot that begins in Whispers in the Walls, but I've listed it here because it expands upon the Void, which is the focus of Arc 4. I didn't have no expectations going into Jade Shadows, but I didn't have high ones. That's not to say I thought it would be bad, just that I knew it wasn't part of the main storyline of Arc 4, and most of my favorite quests had been integral to the main plot at this point. I was expecting another Angels of the Zariman. When I found out Jade Shadows was 30 to 40 minutes long, I was a little bit worried it would feel like it was over before it got started. All of those preconceived notions faded away when I actually played it, and now, I think Jade Shadows is one of the greatest pieces of story content in all of Warframe. The quest is a fascinating character study on the Stalker, even though he barely has any dialogue. However, his silence speaks louder than anything he could actually say. The Stalker is desperately trying to save his partner Jade, a Warframe who he loves, despite how much he hates Warframes. Hunhow tries to convince him to ask the operator for help healing her, but Stalker is hesitant because of his hatred for the Tenno. Instead, he raids Corpus facilities, stealing medical supplies that he hopes will save Jade. Eventually, Stalker gives in and contacts the operator, who initially thinks he's there to kill them yet again, but realizes that he just needs their help. The pair returns to Jade and the operator discovers that there's void energy eating away at her, and yet she isn't fighting back. They try to save her, but Jade dies in what's revealed to be childbirth. Jade and the Stalker have created the very first Tenno child, a void anomaly that shouldn't be possible and yet is. This reveal was incredible and completely unexpected to me. What comes next is an absolutely phenomenal sequence, where Soren, which is what Jade calls the Stalker, picks up his child and carries them through waves of attacking Corpus, trying to escape. When Soren reaches the surface, Corpus realizes he's holding a child and stops attacking. They show him compassion, something very rare for them, considering they worship Prophet like a god, and allow Soren to pass, taking his ship to the reservoir. Here, the player has the option to name the child, Sirius or Orion. I chose Orion. This sequence is set to some of the best music in Warframe, Angel's Requiem and Final Ascent. Both tracks capture the haunting but also slightly hopeful tone, as Jade has died, but willingly sacrificed herself so that her child can live. The choral vocals elevate both tracks, giving the first the feeling of a requiem, emphasizing the tragedy of the loss of Jade, the child's loss of a mother. While the second reinterprets that melody into a song that's chord progression combines with building instrumentals to give a strong sense of momentum. It captures the feeling of the Stalker's determination to protect his child, his last living reminder of Jade. They're both so good that I've listened to them on repeat while writing large portions of this script. The character work in this quest is incredible. It got me to finally see into Stalker's inner world and actually root for him for the first time. It's clear he will have a difficult time being a father, given everything he's lost, but at the same time it feels so hopeful, and like his child will give him something he's never had before, if he's able to let his walls down and care for them. I'm a bit of a sucker for the archetype of the parent who's normally tough, but learns to be gentle for their child. I want to see a sequel to Jade Shadows where we learn about the child and see Soren give them a happy life. The idea of a Tenno having a child reminds me a lot of Blade Runner 2049, a movie about what happens when a replicant is able to give birth to an impossible child. I make this comparison flatteringly as it's one of my favorite movies. In Blade Runner 2049, being born is something that's denied of replicants, as they're made by humanity, so learning that a replicant is able to be born symbolizes them claiming their humanity, and kickstarts a revolution against humanity as replicants begin to realize through the child that they can build a future of their own, where they are free. Jade Shadows isn't very long and we don't learn very much about the impact of the birth, but I wonder what it symbolizes for the Tenno, other than a new beginning. I desperately want more. Warframe clearly has a lot to say about parenthood. As you can probably tell, I'm a bit biased against shorter stories. Often I find that shorter stories don't have the time to fully make an impact, and feel like they're often over right when things get good. Jade Shadows is an example of making every second count, and fully utilizing a short format to tell a touching and impactful story. It's truly a triumph, and I hope future short story quests are able to come even close to this caliber of storytelling. Jade Shadows is the only main quest in all of Warframe that I would call perfect. I have no notes. Granted, that's easier to accomplish when a quest is smaller scale and has a more intimate story. The next continuation of the main story is Lotus Eaters, another prologue quest like Apostasy Prologue that only took 5 minutes. Lotus, who for me is Margulis, receives a call from a pager in Entradi's lab, so she beckons the operator and Drifter to talk to her. She says that the Indifference wants to take the operator, her child, and she wants to let it. Margulis determines that the Drifter needs to answer the call to use the paradox to fight the Indifference. The Drifter touches the pager and sees a vision of 1999 with Kalimos, Albrecht's Kavat. Then, Lotus says that the voice is that of angels, devils, and life itself, and that voice is growing louder. She then tells the Drifter they must get to Albrecht before the Indifference does. This gives a little more info, but basically just teases the next quest, the Hex, where the Drifter goes to 1999. It's more like Apostasy Prologue than Prelude to War. I want to know more about Margulis' connection to the Void and Indifference, as it seems like there's something there. I feel like I've only scratched the surface. I don't have any strong opinions on the Lotus Eaters because it's basically just a teaser. A decent one though. Its use of music is, as always, very good.
Please stay. Don't put out the flame and run away.
In the Hex, the Drifter returns to 1999 on the morning of New Year's Eve. In 1999, there's a group of warriors called the Hex that each have the abilities of a different Warframe. They're fighting back against Major Nessie Rusalka, a commander of a faction called the Skuldra, who's being controlled by the Indifference. The Skuldra have captured Entradi, so the plot of the Hex involves the Drifter teaming up with the Hex to find Entradi and prevent the Y2K bug from causing a nuclear power plant to blow up the town. However, the Indifference uses the Skuldra and the Tech Rot infection to take over the town, so Albrecht wants to let the power plant explode, killing the corruption but also the Drifter's 1999 companions. For some reason, this is supposed to help Albrecht get to Tau. The Drifter is given a choice. Let your friends die, sacrificing this alternate reality 1999 for Tau, or try to do both. Stop the Indifference and still save your friends. Apparently 1999 is a time loop, so we see them all die, but Albrecht kills the Drifter, resetting the loop, bringing the Drifter back to the beginning of 1999, allowing them to try to save everyone. However, this is where the quest ends, allowing the player to do missions in 1999 to try and change the outcome. To be 100% honest, I found this ending confusing. I still don't understand why Albrecht went to 1999 specifically, why he thought that the Indifference couldn't follow him there, why it was able to anyways, why the people of 1999 are pseudo-warframes, and why destroying 1999 lets Albrecht get to Tau. The Hex does thankfully give a little bit more information about the Indifference's motivations. Apparently it considers the Orokin butchers, which fair enough, they basically are, and allows the Operator and the Drifter to use parts of its power because the children of the Zariman actually asked it for help. All of these new world-building elements felt kind of incomprehensible to me, and like I was missing a lot of necessary exposition and context. I'm not sure if there's lore or post-quest content that explains this better, but I hope there is, otherwise I think Arc 4 is in a weird spot, where it needs to better explain what's actually going on to feel properly motivated and comprehensible. I haven't done very much of the 1999 post-campaign content yet, because it's all very high-level activities, so I've been working on building building my skill at lower levels before trying to tackle the 1999 stuff. What I did understand is that I think Albrecht is ironically similar to the Indifferents. He's indifferent to the fate of the Hex and their version of 1999, willing to sacrifice them for his own agenda, because he values his future more highly than their lives. This is interesting because it almost sets Albrecht up as a co-villain, more philosophically aligned with the Indifferents than against it. In fact, the Indifferents saved the children of the Zariman, so why am I helping Albrecht and not the Indifferents? By contrast, the Drifter actually cares about the Hex and wants to save them from both sides of the war, who are indifferent to their fates. I think the Drifter sees themselves in the Hex, given that the Drifter's origin is about being abandoned and left for dead. This makes it difficult for them to do the same to the Hex, even if it might be the easier choice. This is why they choose to try and save 1999. They don't want to leave the Hex abandoned in their own version of the derelict Zariman. It's clever theming that makes for a good climax. It just isn't helped by the fact that I didn't understand a lot of the surrounding world building. Digital extremes being ever consistent, the music is on point, featuring 90s inspired music from multiple genres, like pop, alternative, and rock, which helps sell the 90s setting. The story seems inspired by pulpy 80s and 90s movies, given that Y2K and the power plant exploding serve as the main conflict. This is a little bit unrealistic, given that in real life the Y2K bug was known about decades in advance, although not a lot was done to rectify it until the mid-1990s. However, a significant amount of effort was put in place to patch the software of critical infrastructure that relied on software susceptible to the bug, so something like a nuclear reactor would have been a high priority to fix years ahead of time. As a result, the issues that did actually occur were relatively minor, like incorrect dates on receipts, parking meters not working, or video store rentals incorrectly calculating late fees. There was nothing even remotely on the level of the nuclear reactor melting down, but some people did genuinely believe it was going to be the apocalypse. I'm guessing that the Y2K nuclear reactor meltdown was chosen for maximum stakes and impact, even though it's a pretty unrealistic scenario. Granted, I'm saying that about the Space Ninja game, so maybe I'm overthinking it a bit. My imagination does fill in the gaps a little bit, thinking that maybe this alternate 1999 is one where IT professionals' warnings were not taken seriously, and so not a lot was done to rectify the Y2K bug, or that Hollandvania, the town where this takes place, was in some kind of economic downturn and didn't have the resources to patch their critical infrastructure. However, the story doesn't really address this, preferring to hand-wave it and give us an apocalyptic scenario without getting too much into the details. Despite my nitpicking, I still thought the Hex was a fun quest. The vibes and gameplay are immaculate, and there's good thematic storytelling. I didn't actively dislike the Hex, I just had trouble understanding some aspects of it, which did make me like it a bit less than I otherwise would have. I may change my mind if I discover that there are answers somewhere that recontextualizes everything nicely, but I think if that's the case, again, I should be shepherded towards those answers either in the main quest or immediately afterwards, rather than left trying to figure out where they are, if they exist at all. Literally all I would need is like a pop-up pointing me in the right direction, saying that exploring 1999 would provide the answers to the mysteries of Hollandvania or something. Arc 4 is hard to evaluate because I don't think it's over yet. I'm not sure if the upcoming main story quests, the Old Piece and Tau, are considered part of Arc 4 or not, but if I had to guess, they probably are. We've only had 2 major plot-relevant entries in Arc 4 at this point, and the Hex didn't really feel like a conclusion to me. It also doesn't feel like the hostilities have fully kicked off, given that Whisper in the Walls is relatively isolated to Entradi's lab, and the Hex is contained in alternate reality 1999. If I had to guess, I think the actual war will happen in Tau, given that Tau has been a motivation for so many characters thus far. Tau is basically Warframe's White Whale, so it has a lot of expectations to live up to. The main themes of Arc 4 seem to be time travel, love, and the weight of personal sacrifices. I wouldn't be surprised if on Tau, the Operator and Drifter are forced to sacrifice something major in order to prevent the Indifference from destroying everything. What of Arc 4 I've played has been satisfactory. However, it's lacked huge game-changing moments like we got in Arcs 2 and 3, except for Jade Shadows, which technically isn't advertised as part of Arc 4. We don't necessarily need to have huge moments like that for a story to be good, but it also is harder to hit the same highs without them. Based on how good the New War was, I'm confident that Digital Extremes has it in them to pull off Arc 4 and conclude this story arc well. I just don't fully understand where they're going with it yet. Around Arc 4, I started getting more Warframes and eventually ran into the weapon slot problem, but for Warframes. The game has dozens of Warframes, but you only start with a small number of slots, I think 5 or 6. This creates a bigger dilemma for Warframes than weapons, as each Warframe is much more unique and integral to gameplay than an individual weapon, so I have a difficult time selling them like I do weapons. I did the napkin math, and apparently to have one copy of each individual Warframe, you would need to buy roughly $50 worth of platinum just for slots alone, which is a lot. I get that Warframe is a free-to-play game, so the devs need avenues for monetization like this, but it feels kind of bad to be so restricted on the most important part of the game's identity. Starting out with more slots would help a bit. I do generally think that Warframe is relatively fair in its monetization compared to contemporary games, and I would love to support the game by buying platinum as I've really enjoyed it, but unfortunately I can't afford to right now. I've come to love Warframe. I love its story, I love its world, and I enjoy its gameplay. However, as you can probably tell from my review, I think its biggest problem as a game is that it's difficult to get into because it has a ton of systems that are overwhelming and confusing for a new player. Warframe would be easier to get into if the new player experience was streamlined a bit, and there were more explicit tutorials at each step. A lot of the confusion was generated by the sheer amount of quests and gameplay systems on offer, which I can tell have been built up gradually over the last 12 years. It's a good problem for a game to have, as it means there's a lot for a new player to do, but it can also lead to choice paralysis, where deciding what to do next sometimes feels very difficult. This is why I primarily stuck to the story quests early on, as they were a tangible next thing for me to do. There are quite a few answers and tutorials in Warframe, but sometimes it's not obvious where to go to find them, in particular the mechanics whose tutorials are part of rail junctions. There's a series of tutorials in the Codex that I didn't engage with very much, because I forgot they existed until like 100 hours of gameplay in, because of how many other things I was trying to keep track of and learn. I think collecting all of those miscellaneous tutorials and adding entries to the training tab of the Codex would be hugely beneficial, as new players could easily know that whenever they didn't understand something, they could look there for help. I also think the Codex probably should be emphasized more frequently for new players to establish it as a point of reference whenever the player is forgetting how a gameplay system works. In terms of story, it's no secret that I think Warframe is a bit of a mess, but I also think it has great potential. I've already tackled my problems with Arc 1, which makes the narrative hard to get into. I absolutely adored Arcs 2 and 3, which generated a lot of goodwill from me, but Arc 4 feels kinda confusing right now. I'm hoping that there's more material I'm missing in the lore or post-quest content that helps me appreciate it more, or that the next story quest provides more answers. In terms of individual quests, I think my favorites are the New War, the Second Dream, the War Within, and Jade Shadows, followed closely by Chains of Harrow, the Sacrifice, and the Duviri Paradox. I'm excited for the future of the story, and to delve more into the lore and get more detail on these stories and the history of the world. Above all, it was a treat to find a new game that I resonated with this much and was able to fall in love with. My journey with Warframe has only just begun, as I'm aware I've only scratched the surface of everything it has to offer. I can't wait to explore the rest. I've made this video in relative isolation from the Warframe community to keep the analysis unbiased. As a result, my first contact with the broader community is going to be in the comment section of this video. I'm genuinely curious what other people think of this game and the individual quests. If you've watched this far, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd genuinely love to know. Given how much I've enjoyed my first month playing Warframe, I plan to make future Warframe videos, especially once I delve into the lore. If you're interested in watching future videos, consider subscribing. Above all, thank you to everyone for watching.